Game of Thrones, The Attack of the Northern Wolf. This video is purely for entertainment and does not infringe on copyrights or laws. The rights to the novel and image belong to the original author. We do not claim ownership. Don't like waiting and want to listen to this fanfic in full now? Subscribe to our Patreon, where you'll find the best fanfics. Chapter 26, Declaration of War. When Robb brought Theon to the parade ground, the whole parade ground was already full of Stark cavalrymen leading their war horses. Each of these cavalrymen was tall and strong, with untrimmed beards on their faces and hair longer than their shoulders. They wore cloaks made of bear, seal, and wolf skins, embroidered with white sunburst family emblems. Lord Rickard stood in the front, wearing a black half helmet and a black wool cloak with the same white sunburst family emblem. Behind him stood the eldest son and heir, Robb Stark. At this moment, the two brothers Eddard and Torhan were also here. The three brothers were chatting and reminiscing about the past. Lord Robb. As Lord Rickard saluted and greeted, everyone on the parade ground quieted down and saluted respectfully. Well, don't be polite, we are all relatives. Lord Rickard, you have worked hard all the way. What is the purpose of coming to Winterfell this time? Robb smiled and walked to Lord Rickard. While trying to get closer, he asked knowingly, Lord Robb, the Bolton family is openly destroying the foundation of the Stark family. Lord Rickard was straightforward, but not stupid, and he put a big hat on the Bolton family. All the caravans from the north going to White Harbor were plundered by the Bolton family. Half of the caravan members and guards were slaughtered by the bastard son of Roose Bolton. The group of cavalry behind me includes half of the survivors at that time. They saw with their own eyes that the bastard had at least 1,000 cavalrymen. I know this, and many noble families have written to me. However, the Bolton family is a family with a long history in the north after all, with sufficient troops, and the Dread Fort is easy to defend, but difficult to attack. Hundreds of years ago, our Stark ancestors besieged the city for 2 full years before the Bolton family surrendered. Now we have no way to deal with them. Robb looked embarrassed, and his words were full of dissatisfaction with the Bolton family, but his tone was helpless. And my father has just arrived in King's Landing to serve as the hand of the king. I'm taking over the political affairs of Winterfell for the first time, and have never fought a formal war. I'm inexperienced, and cannot compete with a veteran on the battlefield like Roose Bolton. Lord Robb, you can't let Roose Bolton go on. He is destroying the fundamental order of the entire north. Upon hearing this, Lord Rickard replied anxiously, if you agree, I can lead my troops to the Dread Fort and force them to spit out what they have swallowed. Okay, Lord Rickard, I'll do as you say. Robb was delighted upon hearing this. He nodded to Rickard, and then said to the parade ground that someone was announcing loudly, the Bolton family has destroyed the Order of the North, robbed and killed northern caravans everywhere, colluded with wildling tribes, deliberately allowed wildling tribes to enter the Stark family's territory, colluded with the Westeros to assassinate Brandon Stark, and were disloyal to their own feudal family. On behalf of the Guardian of the North, Duke Eddard Stark of Winterfell, I declare war on the Bolton family. Roar. Fight. Tear up the Boltons. For the Starks. For David. Robb's words had just fallen, and Theon and other Winterfell soldiers had not yet reacted. The cavalrymen of the Stark family who had survived the robbery immediately roared excitedly. Lord Rickard was stunned when he heard Robb's loud declaration of war, and his own cavalry responded excitedly. He originally just wanted to gather the strength of the victimized nobles in the north and put pressure on the Bolton family through the Stark family, but he didn't really want to attack the Dread Fort. Moreover, the Bolton family colluded with the wildling tribe and assassinated Brandon Stark. The brave and fearless Lord Rickard will lead the combined forces of the Stark family and the Stark family to attack the Dread Fort. Set out immediately today. Lord Robb. Lord Rickard. Lord Rickard, we will win. We will win. We will win. Listening to the noisy shouts in his ears, Lord Rickard, with a buzzing head, had to force his smile and accept the order to go to the battle. When his mind was fully awake, he had already set out with hundreds of his own cavalry, 4,000 Winterfell infantry, and 500 logistics troops transporting food and supplies, heading towards the Dread Fort. Crack, crack, creak, creak. The Winterfell infantry marched forward in a scattered formation, and the worn mail armor on their bodies made a series of friction sounds. the logistics troops pushed a long dragon-like convoy of carriages loaded with food and supplies, and moved forward slowly. Silently watching all this, Harrion, sitting on his warhorse, frowned. He tilted his head and whispered to his father, "Father, the infantry of Winterfell have assembled in advance, as if waiting for us to set off. Moreover, the weapons and equipment of these infantry are too shabby, and they don't look like regular troops at all." "Well, I know." Rickard nodded, and his thoughts began to clear. He said to his son, "In addition to what you said, it's only a few days to go to the Dreadfort, and there is no need for so many logistical supplies. Lord Robb has prepared so many carriages to transport supplies. This declaration of war on the Bolton family is not simple. Father, what should we do?" "Keep going. Our family is all cavalry. If we really fight with the Bolton family and the situation is unfavorable, we can retreat safely at any time with these infantry blocking us. The Dreadfort is located in the upper reaches of the River of Tears, with the entire Lonely Mountain behind it, so the Bolton family has the rare mineral resources in this barren northern border. The Bolton family also benefited from this. For so many years, they have been strong and powerful, and the army has extraordinary combat effectiveness. The reputation of the Dreadfort as being easy to defend, but difficult to attack, is well known in the north. This is a very solid war fortress, and the entire Dreadfort is a stepped structure. On each towering stone wall, there are at least 3 garrison bunkers. The tops of these bunkers are covered with sharp jagged battlements. Just from the appearance, it makes people feel a little cold and ominous. The Dreadfort is surrounded by water on one side and mountains on 2 sides, so only the front gate can be entered and exited. Robos had just led more than 700 family cavalrymen and returned to the Dreadfort through the front gate. A tall and thin man, a warrior with a goatee, stepped forward and held the reins of his warhorse. After Robos stepped off his horse, the man with the goatee reported, "Lord Robos, I just received news. Robb Stark declared war on our Bolton family." He appointed Rickard Stark as the commander-in-chief and led about 5,000 infantry and 500 cavalry to march towards the Dreadfort. "Huh. The little wolf cub declared war? You are even more impatient than I expected." Robos took off his black gloves and handed them to the man with the goatee. He smiled and continued, "Loke, issue a call for all troops in the territory, except for the Dreadfort garrison, to gather at Stony Iron Town." "Yes, sir." Loke took the order and left. After Robos continued to give a few combat orders, he sat in the Dreadfort, waiting for the guests to come. There are more than 1,000 soldiers, and there is no limit. When the joint army of about 5,000 people arrived at the outskirts of the Dreadfort, the crowds of people and the black mass had already given the Dreadfort guards an inexplicable sense of pressure visually. The Battle of the Dreadfort has begun. I beg readers to vote and follow me. Thank you. Chapter 27 First Battle. The first day the Allied forces arrived at the Dreadfort, they began to set up camp. Since the logistics wagons transported enough supplies, the military tents set up by the Allied forces far exceeded the scale that 5,000 soldiers should have. The Bolton garrison reported this to Robos, but after analyzing the feedback from the scout cavalry, he believed that this was a deception array set up by the young wolf to deliberately increase pressure on them. At the same time, the logistics troops began to use the empty transport wagons after unloading the supplies to cut down and transport trees from the surrounding forests, and built crude and primitive siege equipment in full swing. The overall appearance of the Allied forces was in good shape, but 3 days later, the logistics troops continued to transport wood and build equipment, and did not even launch a tentative attack. On the gate wall of the Dreadfort, Robos looked at the camp of the Allied forces in the distance, thinking expressionlessly. As 3 days passed, the Allied forces' silent performance made him clearly feel that something was wrong. After integrating the information, Robos, who still had no idea, carefully thought about his own deployment method and strategic layout in his mind, trying to find the problems. At present, the Dreadfort has 1,500 soldiers stationed, including 1,300 elite infantrymen for defense, and 200 cavalrymen waiting for an opportunity to launch a surprise attack. On Loke's side, 3,000 local militia infantrymen and 1,000 cavalrymen have gathered in Stone Iron Town, half a day's journey from the Dreadfort. Ramsay also has more than 400 cavalrymen, who are galloping towards the Dreadfort as a reserve force support. The Dreadfort is easy to defend, but difficult to attack. As long as the joint army starts to attack the city, the Dreadfort will become a meat grinder. The current defenders are enough to hold back all the joint forces outside the city. When they suffer heavy losses and their morale drops sharply, Loke's troops will attack from the rear. At that time, the Dreadfort will attack from the front and back, and the joint army will be attacked from both sides, and they will definitely win in one battle. Woo. On the morning of the 4th day, the Dreadfort finally ushered in its first siege. There were about 1,000 Winterfell infantrymen holding direwolf flags, and wearing tattered mail armor, holding huge wooden shields crudely made by the logistics troops. They formed a huge rectangular square, and marched towards the gate of the Dreadfort with heavy steps. Under the protection of their wooden shields, other infantrymen carried freshly made siege ladders. Robb stood on the wall of the Dreadfort gate, watching the Winterfell soldiers who began to attack the city, and he breathed a sigh of relief. He raised his right hand, and stopped in midair, and the archers on the wall held their breath waiting for his order. Shoot! As the infantry stepped into the attack range, Robb waved his hand fiercely, and gave the order. Swish, swish, swish. Hundreds of arrows gleaming coldly in the morning sun drew beautiful and deadly parabolas, and fell like raindrops on the Winterfell soldiers' square. Drool, drool, drool. Ah. The rain of arrows fell on the wooden shields, making a low muffled sound, just like hail falling. Most of the arrows were blocked by the wooden shields, but there were always some unlucky people on the battlefield, who were hit by arrows through the gaps in the joints of the wooden shields, and fell to the ground, making heart-wrenching screams. The Winterfell attacking phalanx could not stop for these unfortunate people, and continued to move forward unswervingly. Behind them, some soldiers of the ambulance team with linen tied on their heads came to rescue in groups of 2 with long shields. They took a general look at the wounded on the ground, and gave up directly if they could not be treated. If there was hope of treatment, one person would hold the shield, and the other would drag the wounded to the rear position. As soon as the Winterfell attacking phalanx arrived at the front gate of the Dreadfort, the wooden shield phalanx quickly separated, and the infantry hidden inside quickly erected the siege ladder towards the city wall. At this time, the Bolton family soldiers on the city wall began to throw stones the size of their heads down, accompanied by a lot of arrows. Ah! Ah! The screams of the Winterfell soldiers were endless. Those who were hit by arrows would not necessarily die, but those who were hit by stones would definitely have their heads exploded, and red and white splashed everywhere. Some of the soldiers of Winterfell holding bows and arrows under the wall began to fight back. Some of the soldiers of the Bolton family were shot by arrows, and fell to the ground, before they could throw the stones in their hands. Taking advantage of this opportunity, the infantry of Winterfell began to climb up the siege ladder. Crash! A Winterfell infantryman was concentrating on climbing the siege ladder. Suddenly, he heard the sound of water flowing above. He subconsciously looked up. A stream of hot boiling oil directly covered his face tightly. Ah! The skin and flesh on the infantryman's face were immediately burnt red and ulcerated, and blisters appeared all over his face. The skin tissue cracked and rolled. The infantryman didn't care about holding the ladder. He fell straight down with his face covered. Due to the posture problem, his head hit the ground first. The whole person no longer screamed and struggled, but his right foot twitched slightly. It seemed that he was not going to survive. It wasn't just this one Winterfell infantryman who fell. The Winterfell infantrymen on the siege ladders fell down like dumplings. As the Bolton defenders on the wall took various defensive measures, the Winterfell infantry phalanx under the wall lost more than 30% of its soldiers, and their morale was extremely low. As an infantryman looked at the bodies of his comrades who died in various tragic ways, and ran away like crazy, the entire Winterfell infantry siege line began to collapse. The wooden shields, siege ladders, and standard longswords were all discarded. These fleeing infantrymen just wanted to run faster. How could the Bolton defenders on the wall miss such an opportunity? They all worked harder to beat the fallen dogs, hoping to win more credits for themselves. Oh. When the Winterfell infantrymen fled out of the attack range, the Bolton defenders all roared in celebration. Robb looked at the Winterfell infantryman who fled back to the base camp, with a blank expression on his face, and it was unknown what he was thinking. Has Luke replied? Robb suddenly asked the attendant beside him. Lord Loke sent out a cavalry reconnaissance team and began to track and observe the enemy army since they arrived at the Dread Fort. The total enemy strength is about 5,100, including 500 logistics troops. They have been cutting wood and transporting wood from the woods near Lonely Mountain every day during this period, and there has been no abnormal behavior. The attendant in chainmail heard Rose's question and immediately answered, although there are some bare hills on the road from the Dreadfort to Stone Iron Town, there are no woods, gullies, etc. that can hide a large group of people and set up an ambush. Lord Loke has brought people to confirm it repeatedly. Well, what did Ramsay say? After hearing the report, seeing that he was indeed a little worried, Rose nodded and asked about the situation of the illegitimate child. Lord Ramsay will need at least 5 riding days to arrive. According to reports from his spies, Robb Stark meets with the lords of various noble families in Winterfell every day. Well, I was too cautious after all. Write back and tell Loke to prepare for battle. After listening to the latest situation report, Rose nodded and gave his orders. Also, let Ramsay come back slowly. When he comes back, the war will be over. After receiving the order, the servant hurried down the city wall and went to the crow's nest to convey Rose's order. Chapter 28 General Attack. Stone Iron Town is a mining town of the Bolton family. On weekdays, there are at least 500 troops of the Bolton family stationed here. Because of these two reasons, this town is quite prosperous. The first caravan leader killed by Ramsay said that he was going to the Dreadfort to do business, which meant coming to Stone Iron Town to trade. Compared with other businesses, the red light area of Stone Iron Town can be said to be the most luxurious. After all, the undisciplined night watchman in Castle Black can support the development of the red light business in Mole Village, let alone here. Since Earl Rose recently summoned all the soldiers in the territory together, the red light district of Stone Iron Town can be said to be full every day recently. After all, these soldiers are either fighting with prostitutes or fighting with other soldiers. Beep. A loud horn sounded, and the red light district of Stone Iron Town immediately exploded like an ant nest being filled with water. Many ragged soldiers rushed towards the direction of the horn, while tidying up their clothes. To the east of Stone Iron Town is a garrison sentry of the Bolton family. After a burst of noisy noises, 4,000 Bolton family soldiers lined up. Due to the large number of soldiers, the queue stretched straight to the gate of the sentry. Loke stood at the front of the queue with a serious face. After the 4,000 troops were assembled, he gave a loud speech and pointed to the front, asking the army to set off. Loke had no expectations for this war because he had long known that the Bolton family would win. Not only because of Lord Rose's shrewd calculations, but also because the Bolton family had a killer hidden. A large number of heavy cavalrymen wearing armor and horses passed in front of him. On the armored war horses, these knights holding shields and spears had an unstoppable momentum. The siege of the Dreadfort has entered the 6th day. The second siege yesterday repeated the situation of the first one. Hundreds of siege infantry were lost, and they still had not even climbed the walls of the Dreadfort. At the beginning of today, the morale of the Winterfell infantry was low. If there were no supervisors behind them, they might not even be willing to go to the attack range of the Bolton soldiers. The third siege was completely different from the first one. The casualties of Winterfell this time were relatively low. Because these infantrymen had no intention of attacking the city at all, they kept hiding in wooden shields under the city wall and never went out. After a long attack without success, the Winterfell infantrymen left behind some unlucky bodies and hurriedly fled back to the camp of the joint army. Trog was a commander of the Winterfell infantry, commanding thousands of infantrymen. Looking at the sloppily conducted third siege, he shook his head and walked towards the tents behind him. The tents of the joint forces were arranged in the shape of a Chinese field, and the tents of 4,000 Winterfell infantrymen were located in the front half closest to the Dreadfort. The Karstark cavalry led by Earl Rickard occupied the tents in the back half. The transport carriages of the logistics troops were arranged horizontally at the end of the field shape, as if to prevent the soldiers of the joint army from escaping. Moreover, the military tents of the Karstark and Stark sides were clearly separated, with the Karstark cavalry standing guard in the middle. Trog had already complained in his heart. Nearly 600 Karstark cavalrymen actually occupied the same number of military tents as their 4,000 men. Isn't this clearly a special treatment? Moreover, in the nearly 3 days of siege, there was no trace of these cavalrymen. Although the cavalrymen were not needed in the siege, they should at least be on guard around the battlefield to prevent the cavalry in the Dreadfort or the enemy's reinforcement cavalry from raiding. In the current situation, without the Karstark cavalry to cover the defense, the Winterfell infantry would be at the mercy of the enemy cavalry. Stop. No one is allowed to enter the rear military tent without the permission of Lord Rickard. Trog was walking backwards with his head down and was stopped by a cavalryman in front. I'm Trog, the commander of the Winterfell infantry. I have suggestions on siege and would like to meet Lord Rickard. Seeing the cavalry blocking his way, Trog suppressed his anger and said loudly, Lord Rickard's order is to continue attacking the Dreadfort. No suggestions are needed. You just need to obey orders. The cavalry obviously did not want Trog to enter the military tent behind him and directly rejected his request to meet. Trog was immediately angry when he heard this. Although they loyally obeyed the orders of Lord Robb of Winterfell and fought for him, but the commander-in-chief he chose was useless and would only send them to die in vain. This feeling of being betrayed by loyalty made Trog explode directly. I think there are serious problems with Lord Rickard's siege tactics. Our Winterfell soldiers will not die in vain and will never continue to attack the city. If you refuse the military order, the supervisory team has the right to execute you. Come on. Let's see whether you have more people or we have more people. The loud quarrel between the two immediately attracted the attention of many soldiers around. They looked at Trog and the other man, who were whispering in twas and threes. Okay, stop arguing. Lord Rickard wants you to go in. A Karstark cavalryman ran from the rear tent, stopped the quarrel, and said to Trog. Trog, whose face was red from the quarrel, heard the words, and stopped entangled with the other party. He walked past the cavalryman with his chest held high. In the center of the rear tent, there was a much wider tent. This was the tent of Count Rickard. Trog found that there were many cavalry guarding around the tent. Basically, there was a guard every 2 or 3 steps. With so many guards, this Count Rickard was too timid. Trog, who was dissatisfied, muttered in his heart and walked into the tent with his head held high. After a while, Trog, with a respectful face, bowed his head and kept a salute posture and left the tent. When the tent was completely closed, he immediately showed a happy face, turned around and walked quickly towards his own tent. After returning to the military tent, he immediately gathered the remaining infantry commanders who were recruited to participate in the war, and then said, tomorrow we will launch a general attack, and this time we must be prepared to fight to the death. On the 7th day of the siege of the Dreadfort, birds were flying freely in the sky, and the morning sun had just cast its first rays of sunlight on the Dreadfort, and a heavy horn sounded, breaking the quiet atmosphere. The Dreadfort defenders found that the attack of the joint army this time was completely different. Not only were there many more infantrymen with wooden shields, but their offensive pace was also much faster. Prepare fortifications. You quickly notify Lord Drohos. On the wall of the Dreadfort, a responsible officer felt that this attack was unusual and made his own judgment at the first time. Soon, the siege of the Dreadfort was in full swing. The Dreadfort guards still use the 3 old methods of bows and arrows, stones, and boiling oil, but the morale of the joint army this time was completely different, and the intensity of the siege was very sharp. Whenever a Dreadfort guard dared to expose his body and throw defensive items outside the city wall, the Winterfell archers below would greet him. Seeing their comrades being killed and injured, the Dreadfort guards were a little breathless under the pressure of the archers below the city wall. On the siege ladder beside the city wall, the infantry of the joint army had crawled most of the way and were getting closer and closer to the city wall. At this moment, Drohos, who arrived in time with the soldiers on rest, calmly began to command the reinforcement to quickly fill the vacancies. Don't panic, guard your own area. The victory of this war must belong to us. The Bolton family's mining town and heavy cavalry were originally added to make the war more exciting and intense. Please regard it as the trump card that the Bolton family has never used. P.S. Thank you Yekti and Kinshabahezi for your monthly tickets, and thank you for your daily votes and readers. Please continue to support this book. Chapter 29 Heavy Cavalry Charge. A Winterfell siege infantryman luckily dodged the attack of the Bolton defenders and was about to climb up the wall of the Dreadfort along the siege ladder. As soon as he showed his head, he saw a bolton defender holding a stone. The two of them were stunned for a moment, and then they immediately reacted. The long sword of the Winterfell infantryman pierced the chest of the bolton defender, and the stone of the bolton defender also hit the opponent's face heavily. The brave Winterfell infantryman screamed and fell down, but the next Winterfell infantrymen took advantage of the temporary lack of people to fill the defense gap and rushed up the wall. The third, the fourth, a small group of Winterfell infantrymen gradually gained a foothold on this wall and began a fierce close combat with the bolton defenders. Go. Rose, who was standing on the rock steps at the end of the wall, saw the gap at a glance. He waved his hand at the bolton soldiers waiting in line on the rock steps, and the group of bolton soldiers rushed fiercely towards the Winterfell infantrymen who had climbed the wall. Viscous blood flowed along the stone slabs of the wall, and broken limbs with irregular bones were everywhere. The gap in the wall was like a crowded slaughterhouse. Soldiers from Winterfell continued to pour in, and the bolton defenders also lined up on the inner wall steps, waiting to fill the gap. I didn't see Rickard's cavalry from beginning to end, but those hundreds of cavalry can't change anything. Even though the gap in the wall had not been filled, Rose still looked calm. After making a judgment in his heart, he issued a counterattack order to the attendants beside him. Notify Loke to start the attack. Let the cavalry in the city get ready to attack. In a hilly area 1 kilometer away from the battlefield, Loke's troops, who had been prepared for a long time, began to march quickly to the rear of the joint armies tent as soon as they received Rose's order. As a capable subordinate recognized by Luce, Loke also has rich combat experience. He clearly assigned the attack methods of his troops. Once they entered the attack range, the 500 heavily armored knights wrapped like tin cans would charge head on. With their powerful impact and excellent defense, they only needed one charge to penetrate the joint army. The other 500 bolton family light cavalry were divided into two teams, bypassing from the left and right wings. When the heavy cavalry penetrated the formation, they could cut like a sharp blade. The last 3,000 infantrymen were to encircle and suppress the deserters whose formation was disrupted and who were fleeing everywhere. Da. As the 1,000 cavalrymen of Loke's troops marched forward, the deafening sound of horse hooves reached the tents of the joint army. But seeing the dense bolton reinforcement in the distance, the soldiers guarding the tents were not panicked at all. Woo, woo, woo. As 3 consecutive horn sounds like secret signals rang out, the tents in the back half of the allied army's formation were torn open, and densely packed Winterfell soldiers poured out. At the same time, the transport wagons at the end of the formation were pulled open, and the soldiers quickly placed the recently made ancient Chinese chevorks defries on the wagons in front of them. These chevorks defries were fixed into an 30th shaped frame by 2 rows of wooden pillars, and these wooden pillars were inlaid with various sharp iron spikes. After the fortifications were properly placed, these soldiers wearing chainmail with the emblem of the direwolf quickly and regularly lined up in a row, forming the most commonly used defensive square formation. The first row of spearmen stood on the transport wagons, holding their weapons horizontally, and the iron spears flashed coldly in the sun. The second row of spearmen placed the iron spearheads on the chevorks defries, and the tails of the spears against the ground, pointing obliquely through the gaps in the chevorks defries at the bolton reinforcement who were beginning to speed up their attack. On the wall of the Dreadfort, Rose immediately saw the soldiers of Winterfell who suddenly appeared in the coalition army. Although he didn't know how these soldiers hid in the tents from the scout cavalry, he thought that his family's heavy cavalry would definitely crush their defensive formation. However, for the first time, he felt panic in his heart, as the situation on the battlefield was not under his control. Loke couldn't see the situation in the coalition army's tent. He just saw that the enemy army in front had placed some obstacles. In his opinion, under the charge of the heavy cavalry, those wooden stakes would also be smashed to pieces. And the current situation did not allow him to stop and observe the enemy carefully. After entering the attack range, the heavy cavalry began to accelerate slowly, and the light cavalry on both sides also began to detour, preparing to attack the enemy's wings. The infantry behind him also began to charge with swords, but compared with the cavalry, their charge speed was too slow, and the overall formation had been distorted since the charge. Pikemen, hold your position. Archers, move to the left wing. Draw your bows and prepare. Target the enemy cavalry on the left. Behind the formation of the Winterfell soldiers, the fully armed Theon was excited and commanded his troops to adjust their formation. After all, this was the first time he led an army of more than 1,000 people to fight. "Theon, you forgot to give the signal." Owen beside him reminded him expressionlessly. "Haha, Owen, thanks for your reminder." As a black smoke rose in the military tent, the war behind the allied army had also begun. Boom boom boom. The 500 heavily armored cavalrymen, who had approached 100 meters away, were like thunder and thunder rushing in front of them. 90 meters. 80 meters. 70 meters. Whiss, whiss, whiss. A heavily armored cavalryman who was rushing in the front, lost his horse's feet, and fell heavily into a pit, emitting a miserable wail. A cavalryman behind him who had no time to stop also followed in his footsteps. Like a chain reaction, several heavy cavalrymen stepped on the pits camouflaged with branches and snow, and fell heavily to the ground. But these cavalrymen were indeed excellent riders. Except for the one who fell in front of them, the rest of the cavalrymen controlled their horses to avoid them. But there were many such traps in this short distance of dozens of meters. When this group of heavy cavalrymen were about to rush to the barricades, they had lost at least 40 or 50 companions. Robb ordered us to have the logistics team secretly dig this horse trap at night, and the effect is really good. Theon, who was watching the heavy cavalrymen step on the trap and fall to the ground at first, smiled and said to Owen, "Well, it's just that this method is not glorious enough." Owen, who has a young face, speaks with the charm of an old noble. "Well, you should get to know Jon. On the battlefield, only methods that can effectively kill the enemy are good methods." Theon rolled his eyes when he heard this. "They're coming soon. I'll go to the front first." Owen said nothing more. He pulled down the visor of his helmet with a serious face and walked towards the spearmen. When it comes to serious matters, Theon will certainly not smile anymore. He reached out and pulled down his visor and stared straight ahead. Bang! Snap! The impact of the heavy cavalry is no joke. They are like a heavy tank crashing into the Chevork's defries. The Chevork's defries was directly broken by them. The spikes made temporarily on the Chevork's defries could not penetrate their heavy armored defense at all. Whack! The reaction force of breaking the Chevork's defries was also fed back to the first row of charging horses. The horses, whose sternums were broken countless times, spurted blood from their mouths and fell to the ground. The heavy cavalry on their backs fell to the ground fiercely and then were ruthlessly trampled by the subsequent charging cavalry horses. Puff! The long spear of a heavy cavalryman pierced through a long spearman on a transport carriage, but several sharp iron spearheads beside him also penetrated into his and his horses' bodies, piercing them like rag dolls. Thank you for your monthly votes, and also thank you for voting and reading every day. I have seen every vote and comment of yours. I will work hard to write, and thank you for your support when the book is online. Chapter 30, Fierce Battle. The impact of the second row of heavy cavalry did not make the first row of spearmen feel good. The strong ones could barely resist and stand on the transport wagons. The spearmen who could not resist were directly knocked out of the transport wagons and hit the second batch of spearmen, which immediately caused the nearby spearmen to fall off their horses. After the 3 rows of bolts and heavy cavalry charged, no one in the first row of spearmen was standing on the transport wagons. But the enemy heavy cavalry rushed over like a tide, wave after wave. The second row of spearmen put the butts of their spears on the ground, which buffered a lot of force for them, and temporarily blocked this heavy tide. With the buffer time, the third row of reserve spearmen commanded by Owen immediately stepped forward to fill the gaps in the first row of spearmen. The heavy cavalry and spearmen who were charging head-on were already bleeding profusely, and the bolts and light cavalry on both wings began to charge. Shoot! Theon waved his hand and shouted loudly. The 500 archers he arranged on the left let go of their bowstrings and immediately shot a dense rain of arrows into the sky. Loke was leading the charge towards the enemy's right wing, the left wing of the Winterfell phalanx. Although they were light cavalry, they were not afraid of enemy archers at all. They were protected by helmets and mail, and as long as they were not unlucky enough to be shot in the gaps of mail, they would be fine. But he found that the sky suddenly darkened. Whoosh! The 500 Winterfell archers and most of the shield-bearing infantry were arranged by Theon on the left side of the formation, and there were only less than 500 ordinary infantry on the right side, lined up for defense. This resulted in Loke's 250 bolt and light cavalry being baptized by a saturated rain of arrows. Ding ding ding. Whoosh, whoosh. The arrows that crossed the parabola hit the cavalry wearing solid armor, making a ding-dong sound. But their horses were defenseless, and some sharp arrows penetrated the horses' heads, causing them to fall to the ground dead. Some arrows shot into the horses' bodies, causing them to scream and move forward a few steps before falling to the ground. The cavalrymen on them all fell heavily to the ground and were trampled like rags by the horses behind them. Loke was unlucky, as the horse under him was hit in the head by a stray arrow, and he fell off on the spot. But he was also lucky, as he was not trampled by any of the horses in the torrent of galloping horses. Puff. Loke opened his mouth and spat out a mouthful of blood. He endured a strong dizziness and struggled to get up from the ground. He immediately looked at the battlefield and the cavalrymen who were charging. The archers of Winterfell only had time to shoot the second arrow, and then they immediately dispersed from the left and right sides and retreated to the rear of the camp. Behind the archers, teams of Winterfell infantrymen holding single-person shields with an elliptical upper part and a sharp lower part in the shape of an inverted triangle maintained a neat formation and marched forward step by step. Raise your shields. Swish. With the order of the infantry commander, these infantrymen fiercely inserted the lower part of the shields into the soil, tightly grasped the handles inside the shields, and waited for the impact of the enemy cavalry. Bang, bang, bang. After 2 rounds of arrow rain, only about half of the cavalry led by Loke remained. Holding back their anger, they slammed hard on the shields of the Winterfell infantrymen, making a continuous muffled sound. This was purely a collision of strength. The Winterfell infantrymen who were knocked away could hear the sound of their bones breaking in their bodies. The Bolton cavalrymen who were forcibly stopped from charging were stabbed by the nearby infantrymen, watching their lives slip away with the bright red blood. On the walls of the Dreadfort, the morale of the Winterfell siege soldiers, aroused by the high bounty offered by the commander, slowly faded as the cruelty of the war increased. The gap in the wall was still there, but the brave and fearless soldiers were basically killed or wounded on the wall, and the remaining infantrymen behind them all shrank back. These recruited territorial militia infantrymen had no courage and awareness to fight to the death. Trog, the infantry commander under the wall, saw this situation and knew that the morale was gone and the siege could no longer continue. So he commanded the remaining militia infantrymen to move closer to the gate of the Dreadfort and block the gate tightly, at least not giving them the opportunity to leave the city to support the main battlefield in the rear. Seeing that there were fewer and fewer Winterfell soldiers in the gap in the wall, Rose knew that the overall situation of the battle here was determined. His focus was no longer here, but on the rear tent of the allied army in the distance. When his trump card, the charge of the heavy cavalry, was blocked by the Winterfell spearmen, Rose, who was not happy or angry, just frowned slightly. When Rose saw that the formation of the left wing of Winterfell was twisted and deformed by the impact of his own cavalry, he finally couldn't hold it anymore, and a hint of joy appeared on his face, because his own cavalry only needed to make more efforts to disperse the formation. The formation of spearmen who blocked the heavy cavalry would be crushed by this straw. Even if Winterfell didn't know when to hide its troops, the Bolton family would definitely win this battle. But the left wing of Winterfell's camp was stockpiled with heavy troops by Theon in advance. Compared with the seemingly endless left-wing infantry, the more than 100 Bolton cavalry were still too few, and the charge gradually became weak and slowly submerged in the infantry wave. Seeing that the left-wing cavalry had been annihilated, Rose, who was no longer happy, looked at the right-wing cavalry who had taken a detour due to the terrain. The cavalry charging on the right wing were very familiar with the terrain near the Dreadfort. The seemingly flat ground in this direction was actually some stepped faults. These faults were not very high, and cavalry with superb riding skills could easily jump over them. But in this way, the speed of the horse's charge will inevitably be affected, and the threat to the enemy camp will be greatly reduced. So they bypassed these faults as they were familiar with. Although it took a little more time, their cavalry, because there were no archers blocking them in front, maintained a complete formation and charged towards the Winterfell soldiers' camp. The cavalry, which was fully accelerated, charged very fast. In the blink of an eye, the distance between the two sides had been shortened to 10 meters. The cavalry at the front seemed to have seen the nervous faces of the infantry on the opposite side. Woo. In the infantry formation on the right, a senior officer commanded his subordinates to blow the horn. These charging Bolton cavalry suddenly saw that on the left and right sides of them, dozens of Winterfell soldiers hiding in the tunnel lifted the camouflaged wooden boards on their heads, stood up and pulled the fist-thick iron chains in their hands. Hula. Several iron chains were quickly pulled and tightened, making a collision sound. The Bolton cavalry, who had no time to stop, drove their horses at an extremely fast speed and crashed into these iron chains. Woo. The horses in this battle were really miserable. The horses of the right-wing cavalry were tripped by the iron chains and fell down with the horses. Some of the horses stopped in time in front of the iron chains, but the inertia of the sudden stop threw the cavalrymen several meters away. Horses stepped on people. Horses stepped on horses. The right-wing cavalry, who had been charging, were thrown upside down by a few iron chains on the ground. The cavalrymen and horses who fell to the ground first were trampled to a bloody mess by their comrades, and there was basically no chance of survival. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 31. Attacked from both sides. Charge. How could the commander of the right-wing infantry of Winterfell give up such an opportunity to hit the downed dog? He directly issued the attack order. On the right side of the infantry formation, the first row of shield soldiers immediately raised their shields and turned sideways after receiving the order. The whole looked like a shutter door opened horizontally. Behind them, teams of Winterfell infantrymen with small round shields and one-handed swords rushed out. These infantrymen had scorching eyes and high fighting spirit. Because this group of cavalrymen who fell a few meters in front of them and were struggling to get up were like a bunch of military merits delivered to the door. A tripwire, a few chains can solve more than 200 cavalrymen. I really like Robb's dishonorable means. Everything is in his plan. Has he grown to this point? It's terrible. Looking at the right-wing battlefield without suspense, Theon felt a complex emotion of admiration and a little fear towards Robb. On the left side of the cavalry charge, Loke, who had joined several cavalrymen who fell off their horses, but were lucky to survive, had already seen the destruction of the right-wing cavalry. At present, there are only a few cavalry left on the left, and most of the heavy cavalry on the front are still alive, but they are firmly bitten by the enemy's spearmen, and cannot escape at all. There is still hope. Loke's eyes fell on the 3,000 infantry troops charging behind him. As long as the infantry of the Bolton family can take over the battle with the infantry of Winterfell, let the heavy cavalry break free from their entanglement, then they will definitely be the trump card of the Bolton family with most of their remaining strength. Let's go and join the infantry. After analyzing the battlefield situation in his mind and making a decision, Loke immediately said to the surviving cavalry. Their horses had already turned into corpses on the ground, so they could only run towards the infantry camp. Looking at the Bolton family infantry getting closer and closer, Loke showed a knowing smile on his face. Da-da-da. A familiar sound of horse hooves from thousands of cavalrymen came into Loke's ears, and his smile froze on his face. Because the Bolton family could not have such a number of cavalry. Even if Ramsay arrived in time, his hundreds of cavalry could not make such a noise. Just behind the infantry formation of the Bolton family, a cavalry unit with at least 2,000 people and flags of direwolves was attacking them. Impossible. I sent scout cavalry to investigate the vicinity. How could there be so many cavalry behind them? Where are they hiding? Time went forward a little bit. They can't imagine that we have been hiding behind them. Standing on the back of a hill, Robb looked far ahead at the troops led by Loke, who were advancing at full speed without hiding their traces of marching, and smiled at Lord Rickard beside him. Lord Robb, your wisdom is like the wall of despair, which makes people awe-inspiring. Some time ago, Lord Rickard was shocked when he saw Robb getting out of the carriage transporting wood. He was completely convinced by his recent methods and now sincerely complimented him. Lord Rickard, you are so polite. In fact, this is all thanks to Bloodwind. Robb replied with a smile, and then continued, the Bolton family scout cavalry, vision, speed, and endurance are far from comparable to Bloodwind. Let Bloodwind follow them from a distance, and then send the location back to me, so that we can always hide in the blind spot behind them. So their scout cavalry is useless in front of us. Of course, other people can't learn this method. Lord Robb, don't be so polite. The Bolton family has been in your plan since the beginning of this war. You just need me, a conspicuous target, to attract his attention. Lord Rickard has thought a lot of things clearly during this period. He continued, let me take the 4,000 militia infantry I have summoned to attract the attention of the Dreadfort. In fact, the elite warriors of Winterfell have already set out and hid in the woods near the Dreadfort in advance. Then use the logistics transport carriages to transport the soldiers to the specially prepared military tents every day and hide them. The Bolton family scouts have been keeping their eyes on the front, but they never thought that you were right under their noses. Under the candlestick, where the candle cannot reach, is the darkest and easiest to hide. Listening to Lord Rickard's story, Robb smiled and summed it up in one sentence. What a simple yet profound truth. My lord, you are too kind. Yesterday, the militiaman named Trog was quite good. I plan to transfer him to Winterfell later. Indeed, he is a relatively outstanding commander. Lord Robb, that is, the signal is coming. In fact, there is no need for Lord Rickard to remind him. Basically everyone can see the eye-catching wolf smoke. Robb looked at the wolf smoke with a firm gaze, drew the long sword on the saddle, pointed to the front and shouted loudly, attack. The warhorse under his crotch has fully accelerated, and Robb can hear the wind in his ears through the helmet. Bloodwind, whose body size is gradually comparable to that of a warhorse, is also following him at the same speed. In this large-scale military battle, Robb did not let Nymeria and the lady follow him to the battlefield. They are not strong enough, and are still developing. They can easily die due to unexpected circumstances. Robb is now in the middle of the charging formation composed of 1,400 Winterfell cavalry and 600 Stark cavalry. This time he did not charge in the front line. In the front were the lancers led by Little John, followed by the light cavalry led by him and Eddard, and finally the Stark cavalry led by Earl Rickard and the Winterfell archers. Personal bravery is of course very important in Westeros, but reasonable and correct tactics and strategies are equally important. This siege of the Dreadfort was full of changes. When Loke's troops attacked, the joint army was in a position where they were attacked from both sides. But when the elite infantry of Winterfell appeared, they resisted and entangled them. When Robb's troops charged, Loke's troops in the middle were in a position where they were attacked from both sides. It was like a layer of sandwich biscuits. Well, Loke's troops, who were now regarded as the sandwich, were definitely not like this description. In the blink of an eye, the Winterfell cavalry were about to catch up with the Loke infantry, who were running forward. Swish, swish, swish. As soon as they entered the attack range of the Winterfell archers, they were at the back and immediately drew their bows and shot. The cavalry that appeared behind them obviously caught these infantrymen off guard, and they began to panic. The sudden rain of arrows quickly expanded this commotion. The infantry of the Loke unit originally had shield infantry in the front and ordinary infantry in the back. Even if their troops of several thousand people were lined up at ordinary times, they could not switch the shield soldiers in the front with the infantry in the back in a short period of time while maintaining the basic formation. Not to mention that they were attacked by the rain of arrows from the Winterfell archers. Suddenly, this group of infantrymen were scattered like ants whose nests were poked. Please continue to vote and read this book. Your support is very important. Thank you. Chapter 32. Unstoppable. Squeak. Little John was wearing a piece of full body plate armor that Robb had found for him, which was relatively rare in the north, and holding a black spear. At the moment, when the two camps came into contact, he pierced the stomach of an ordinary infantryman with a spear and used the powerful impact force to hang the screaming enemy infantryman on the spear and continue to move forward. The first row of Winterfell's lancers could not all be as brave as Little John, but they could basically kill an enemy infantryman with a spear. Those who had escaped their spears were directly knocked away by their tight parallel charge formation. This battlefield, which had just begun to fight, was suddenly filled with shouts and screams. The Bolton family soldier who was picked up on Little John's black spear had not died yet, and his last will to survive made him hold the spear that pierced him tightly. But as the warhorse shook, the organs in his stomach kept falling out, his hands gradually loosened, his eyes began to blur, and he was about to die. Little John is indeed a fierce general. Although there is an enemy hanging on his lance, it does not affect his use at all. He was the first to lead the way. After using his lance to pierce 3 enemy infantrymen in succession, he felt that it was not very smooth. He threw away his lance and pulled out the standard longsword on his saddle. Most of the lancers could not do what Little John did, but facing this group of panicked and scattered ordinary infantry, they were simply unstoppable. They exerted the impact of the cavalry to the fullest and plowed out a no man's land in the infantry camp. The battlefield has never been cruel. After rushing into the enemy infantry camp, Robb swung his longsword left and right. Due to the height of the warhorse, the longsword in his hand was basically aimed at the heads of the enemy infantry. These enemy infantrymen who were chopped by him either had a big gap in their necks or were beheaded directly by him. Behind him, there were local soldiers like human fountains. If Robb were distracted and looked back at his back, he would definitely think of the scene in the Journey to the West movie directed by Chinese star Stephen Chow, where Yang Yan's face was spraying blood in an exaggerated way. The Bloodwind beside him was even more exaggerated, relying on his huge body to charge forward. The lucky enemy infantrymen were only knocked away by it, while the unlucky ones were torn apart by its claws that were sharper than a long sword. A brave enemy infantryman, looking at the unstoppable Bloodwind rushing towards him, did not flee like other infantrymen. Instead, he chose to hold the sword with both hands and rushed towards Bloodwind head on. When the two sides were about to collide, he suddenly fell sideways and slid towards Bloodwind's blind spot and lower abdomen. Crack. Bloodwind, whose 3 measurements were all several times higher than those of a normal direwolf, was huge, but his flexibility was not reduced at all. A light side jump exposed this courageous and thoughtful enemy infantryman to the field of vision again. Then, it lowered its head, opened its jagged wolf mouth, and bit off the infantryman's head. Bloodwind, chewing the snack in his mouth, continued to charge without care, harvesting these fragile lives. From here, we can see some of the power of the blood contract Goldfinger. In just 2 months, the little wolf cub has been trained to be a brutal and violent battlefield harvester. Looking at the infantry troops that were attacked by the cavalry behind them, and whose formation was completely scattered, Loke knew that the situation was over. He looked around, trying to find an ownerless warhorse to escape, but with the sound of horse hooves behind him, the last picture left in his sight was a burly, fully armored Winterfell cavalryman. Little John, who had led the team to break through the entire enemy infantry camp, saw several soldiers wearing Bolton family mail armor on the roadside while continuing to charge, and he took care of them directly. After completing the charge mission, his next target was the iron cans in front of him who were being entangled by the Winterfell infantry. The battle on the walls of the Dread Fort has ended. Below the gate of the wall, the Winterfell warriors, who had long heard the shouts and cries from the direction of the Allied army's tents, were afraid that their retreat would be cut off. They shouted to return to the camp for support and hurriedly fled. This was not a rout, but a return for support that was worse than a rout. Trog was completely unable to stop it. Robb had lost his usual composure. He was secretly biting his gums and glaring at the battle in the Allied army's tent. Although he had already made a judgment in his heart, he still hoped that some miracle would happen. Putting aside the recruited infantry, those cavalry were the fundamental strength of the Bolton family. As the heavy cavalry was surrounded and overwhelmed by the Winterfell cavalry and infantry, the last bit of hope in his heart was extinguished. Order all men in the city who are taller than wheels to be recruited, and women will be responsible for logistical support. All men will participate in the defense of the city after a little training. Rose turned his head and stopped watching the battle outside the city. He gave orders to the servants around him. Send a letter to Ramsay immediately, tell him the battle situation, and ask him to avoid the army of Winterfell and preserve his combat effectiveness. Looking at the servants who took the order and left quickly, although Rose's face was as solemn as water, he was not yet desperate. Although the Bolton family suffered a heavy blow, as long as the Dreadfort was not lost, the foundation would still be there. In the siege of the past few days, the elite infantry of the Dreadfort was lost by more than 200, but they brought more than 10 times the losses to the siege infantry of Winterfell. In terms of combat power, the Dreadfort still has more than 1,000 elite infantry, 200 cavalry, and men in the city, who will be recruited soon. In terms of food, the Dreadfort has always been a war fortress with a special basement for storing food. In addition, there are many caravans looted recently. Is Robbers confident that he can hold out in the Dreadfort for several years, and can the Winterfell soldiers besiege it for several years? The answer is obviously no. However, he can only protect the Dreadfort himself now. Rich places like Stony Town in the Bolton family's territory will definitely be looted. This wolf cub is underestimated. He will become a disaster when he grows up. With a calculation in mind, Robbers immediately walked towards his study in the city. He was going to write a secret letter in his own handwriting and send it to the Lord in the West. The battle outside the Dreadfort has come to an end. When the Winterfell cavalry raided, the victory or defeat of the battlefield had actually been locked. What followed was basically a one-sided massacre. After experiencing a cavalry charge, many of the 3,000 militia infantry of the Bolton family dropped their weapons, raised their hands, and knelt on the ground begging for mercy. But the heavy cavalry of the Bolton family are worthy of being the killer who is loyal to Bolton. They fought to the death with the Winterfell army. Robb thrust the sword into the gap of a heavy cavalryman's helmet, and when he pulled it out, a stream of bright red blood came out. A small stream of red mist rose from the heavy cavalryman, who fell to the ground and sank into his body. At this moment, Robb's eyes were bloodshot, and his whole body was covered with a layer of red mist that only he could see. With his fighting spirit rising, he rode his horse and chopped at the enemy non-stop. The sword in his hand had long been damaged, and it was unknown how many weapons he had taken from the enemy. Chapter 33 Out of Control. Clang. A heavy cavalry horse was carrying his master to fight the enemy. The two sides clashed swords. Sparks flew everywhere. The heavy cavalry felt his right hand numbed by the force of the collision, and he looked at the cavalryman from Winterfell in surprise. The opponent seemed to be unable to feel the recoil of the long sword at all, and immediately slashed at him with another sword. Clang, clang, swish. After 3 swords, the heavy cavalryman, whose right hand was sore and unable to lift it, was killed by the opponent's next sword. The heavy knight's throat was spurting blood, and his body fell softly on the warhorse under his crotch, but his body was stuck on the saddle of the warhorse, and did not fall to the ground. Feeling the weight on its back, the warhorse obviously didn't know that its master had already died. But the cavalryman also seemed to be unaware, and kept waving his long sword and slashing at the armor of the heavy cavalryman's body. Abu. Bloodwind, covered with the blood of the enemy, rushed to the side of the cavalryman and let out an anxious wolf howl. At this time, the battlefield was littered with corpses, and there were few heavy cavalrymen from the Bolton family who could still ride on standing horses. Ed heard the wolf howling, turned his head and saw Robb, who was constantly slashing at a cavalry corpse. Clang, clang, bang. After driving the horse closer, the sound of the long sword hitting the armor became louder and louder. Eddard came to Robb and shouted loudly, "Lord Robb, he is dead." Robb, who was swinging the long sword full of gaps and slashing the corpse's armor, paused when he heard the words. Suddenly, he turned around and slashed at Eddard with a sword. Clang. Seeing Robb's abnormal behavior, Eddard, who was already a little alert in his heart, reacted very quickly and blocked his attack with a sword. Lord Robb is so strong. Eddard, whose right hand was numb, was amazed, but he kept shouting, Lord Robb, I'm Eddard. There are no enemies anymore. AWW. AWW. Bloodwind, who was standing by and observing, clearly felt Robb's abnormality. There was an anxious look in its eyes, and then it took a deep breath and let out a long wolf howl that pierced the entire battlefield. Inside the Dreadfort, Rose, who had just returned to his study to write a letter, also heard the wolf howl. He sneered and said to himself, "Humph, declaring victory?" The walls of the Dreadfort were full of soldiers from the Bolton family. Some of them were guarding the walls and keeping alert, while others were constantly throwing corpses under the walls and cleaning the walls. Hearing Bloodwind's loud wolf howl, they first paused, and then their hearts were unsettled, and they all whispered to each other, "I heard that the young wolf lord was blessed by the old gods." It seems to be true. Yes. Look at that wolf. It's almost as big as a warhorse. This is the first time I've seen Lord Robbo lose his temper. The troops outside have been annihilated. Fortunately, we are inside the Dread Fort. Bloodwind's long wolf howl made Robb's bloodshot eyes regain some clarity, and his slashing action also paused. Lord Robb. It's me, Eddard. When Eddard saw Robb stop attacking, he immediately rode away from Robb's attack range, but he kept shouting. But he only dared to shout from a distance, not close, because he knew that, if he continued to attack, he would definitely die under Robb's sword. Add points to physique. Add points. Robb, whose eyes had regained some clarity, turned his head and stared at Bloodwind beside him, and the idea of adding points to the blood contract came into his mind. The red mist surrounding Robb's body flowed into Bloodwind's body like a stream of water as the blood contract was added. The red mist gradually disappeared, and Robb's eyes became clearer and clearer, until all the blood red completely faded. When Robb felt that he no longer had the urge to slaughter ants, he stopped adding points to Bloodwind. The red mist was all poured into Bloodwind's body, but he did not show any abnormal emotions. I don't know if it is because the strong physique of extraordinary creatures can absorb more red mist compared to humans. Name: Bloodwind. Contractor: Robb Stark. Physique: 29. Speed: 11. Strength: 11. Clan: Psychic direwolf. 6. Wolf Pack: Soldier Wolf, Nymeria, Servant Wolf, Lady. Blood contract points: 39. Robb woke up and immediately checked Bloodwind's attributes. In the days before the battle, Robb had obtained a total of 7 blood points. He only kept 1, and the remaining 6 points were added to Bloodwind's 3 attributes. Since more than 10 attributes require 2 blood points to add 1 attribute, Bloodwind's 3 attributes before the battle were Constitution: 12. Speed: 11. Strength: 11. The side effects of the red mist just now confused Robb, who only wanted to kill people, habitually added Constitution to Bloodwind. In other words, he spent 34 blood points just now, and added them to Bloodwind's Constitution. Through the blood points obtained, Robb silently calculated in his mind that in this battle, he and Bloodwind harvested the lives of 36 enemies. Unknowingly, I have killed many people. Lord Robb, I'm Eddard. The loyal Eddard was still calling Robb from a distance, and at the same time he stopped other cavalrymen from approaching. I'm fine. Seeing Robb smiling and waving in response, Eddard dared to drive his horse closer. I'm not in a good state today. Don't say too much about this matter, and don't ask too much. Do you understand? As soon as he approached, Robb immediately spoke. Yes, Lord Robb. Hearing Robb's order, Eddard's heart tightened, and he immediately replied. Okay, you go and inform Theon and the others to clean up the battlefield, and let the rescue team quickly rescue the wounded. Well, our soldiers will be treated first. Then let Earl Rickard take 1,000 cavalry to guard against possible raids. I'll go right away. Looking at Eddard, who was leaving, Robb, who was still frightened by the side effects of the red mist, reached out and touched the big head of Bloodwind, his eyes wandering and dazed. Destruction is always easier than construction. The cleanup work of the bloody battlefield in front of the Dreadfort was not completed for most of the day. Until the night began to fall, the logistics troops temporarily cleared a place for the soldiers to rest. The soldiers of Winterfell, who were tired all day, except for those who were on guard and forbidden, all began to rest. It is worth mentioning that before sunset, a messenger holding a white flag came out of the Dreadfort. Robb took a rough look at Robb's letter. The gist of it was that the Bolton family did not recognize Robb's reason for declaring war on them, and that it was the bastard Ramsay who plundered the north. He asked Robb to return the prisoners of war and withdraw his troops. As for the soldiers lost in Winterfell, the Bolton family would give war reparations. Robb's Bolton really treated me as an ignorant and reckless boy. After reading the letter, Robb chuckled and tore the letter into pieces in front of the Bolton family messenger. Then he asked the messenger to leave and tell him that, if he surrendered voluntarily, Robb's could be allowed to wear black clothes. Otherwise, he would end Robb's life with his own hands. Thanks to Mr. Natsum Sasiki and Mr. Fatty who loves cats for their monthly tickets. I also thank the big guys who read and voted every day. They are all familiar names. I will list the names before I put it on the shelves. P.S. I think about the plot every day when I go to work and start typing after get off work. Seeing your support. I laughed when I typed myself. Very motivating. Thank you. Chapter 34 Post-war meeting. In the large tent at the center of the Allied army, dozens of candles made the tent as bright as day. At this moment, Robb and others were holding a post-war meeting. Robb, we killed about 2,000 enemies in total. More than 400 heavy cavalry, more than 400 light cavalry, and more than 1,100 militia infantry. The number of prisoners is also close to 2,000. Theon had already sent people to sort out the casualties of the enemy and us in this battle. As soon as the meeting began, he began to report. By the way, it was wise for you to specially add a rescue team. With their timely rescue, our wounded death rate has greatly decreased. Well, this effect is within my expectations. There are already rescue teams in the south. Go on. Robb nodded and raised his hand to signal him to continue reporting. More than 2,700 of the militia infantry we recruited were killed, and there are about 1,200 left. 200 spearmen, 250 infantrymen, 80 cavalrymen, and more than 400 wounded soldiers of varying severity were killed in Winterfell. With careful preparation, there are still such losses. As one of the oldest families in the north, the Bolton family is indeed extraordinary. Robb shook his head when he heard this. He was a little dissatisfied with such losses. Although he had tried his best to march and deploy troops, he still suffered a lot of losses. This can only show that the elite troops of the Bolton family are indeed extraordinary in combat effectiveness. In this battle, we harvested nearly 500 heavy cavalry armors, nearly 500 light cavalry armors, and more than 700 war horses. There are 3,000 sets of infantry standard equipment and weapons. The Bolton family relies on the mineral resources of the Lonely Mountain and has a good life in the north. After reporting the spoils of war, Theon couldn't help but sigh. Well, let the logistics troops start to sort out and load these spoils. They will be useful after a little cleaning. Robb nodded in satisfaction at the spoils. Seeing that Theon had finished his report, Lord Rickard, who had his own purpose, asked first, Lord Robb, we have learned from the interrogation of the prisoners that there are at most more than 1,000 soldiers left in the Dreadfort. When do you think we should start the siege? Everyone has seen the siege in the past few days. The Dreadfort is easy to defend, but difficult to attack. If we force the siege, the gains will outweigh the losses. Robb shook his head. He had never thought of forcing the siege. Then we fake the illusion of the prisoners' rebellion, lure them out of the city to help, and then annihilate them in one fell swoop. Theon, who was next to Lord Rickard, put forward his own suggestions at the right time. Theon did have some ideas, but they were still too naive. Robb was thinking of rejecting his suggestion, but who knew that the officers of Winterfell around him started to praise him. Good idea. Yes, we can do this. In this way, we don't have to force the siege. Theon, sure. Robb was a little stunned, staring at Theon, who was a little flattered by the praise. He understood a little why during the Battle of the Whispering Wood, Jaime was lured out of the city alone by 200 or 300 people disguised as cavalry of the Tully family. Because the tactical awareness of the generals of Westeros is too rough. As a famous general in the north, Robb Bolton is good at scheming, which is well known to everyone. But even such a person was played around by the young Robb. In order to trap Robb first used Ramsay to trap him and show weakness to the enemy. Then he waited for the northern nobles who couldn't help but come and act as a target on the surface, and then carried out the strategy of repairing the plank road in the open and crossing Chenkang in secret. In the end, some gadgets from the ancient battlefield of China were used to defeat the cavalry of the Bolton family. So it was not Robb's wisdom that defeated Robb's, but he defeated him with the wisdom of the ancestors of China. However, looking at subordinates with such strategic skills, future wars are worrying. At present, he can still fight in person, but in the future, when the battle line is extended and several routes need to advance simultaneously, the generals in command must be able to make correct judgments based on the current situation. Otherwise, it is possible that a defeat in one place will lead to a complete loss. Ahem. When my father taught me about tactics, he analyzed Robb Bolton. Robb coughed dryly, interrupting the heated discussion in the military tent. Seeing everyone's attention focused on him, he continued, "My father said at the time that Robb's fighting style was like a venomous snake hiding in the dark, good at preserving its own strength, and then when the enemy showed a flaw, it would jump out of the darkness and kill him with one blow. This time we will throw these 4,000 militia infantrymen to Robb's as prey with flaws all over their bodies, let him take the bait, and then severely injure him. Do you think that a venomous snake like him who has just been seriously injured will lead his troops out of the city in a short period of time because of this uncertain situation?" Robb's words made everyone in the military tent silent, and there was no heated discussion atmosphere just now. "Then what should we do? Besiege them and wait for them to surrender automatically when they run out of food?" Seeing that the atmosphere in the military tent suddenly became quiet and no one spoke, King Theon took the initiative to speak. "Well, this is a method. Our Stark ancestors used it before, besieging the Dreadfort for 2 years and forcing the Boltons to surrender to us for the first time. But do we have the food and energy to besiege them now? In addition to the strength of the army, logistical supplies are equally important in war." Robb smiled and nodded, praising them, and continued to guide their thinking on tactics. "We have eliminated most of the elite troops of the Boltons and achieved the expected goal. So we should withdraw our troops? Lord Robb, do you think I'm right?" Eddard, who has been following Robb all this time, has made some progress. After thinking for a while, he expressed his thoughts, and after he finished speaking, he looked at Robb, waiting for his answer. "Well, Eddard said it well. However, if the Boltons broke into your territory and defeated your guards, would they just turn around and leave?" Seeing that someone finally got the idea, Robb continued to guide him patiently. "Of course not. They will definitely kill and rob everywhere and insult women." Hearing the question, Eddard tilted his head and thought about the bad reputation of the Bolton family and answered without hesitation. Seeing that Eddard had hit the point, Robb continued to ask, "So, after we withdraw our troops, what should we do? Rob all the women in their territory, and then, Theon, who had been listening quietly, heard Robb and the others talking about this topic, and immediately interrupted with shining eyes. "I support this idea. Withdraw the troops to Robb tomorrow?" Hearing Theon's interruption, before Robb opened his mouth, the officers in the military tent laughed, the kind of laughter that men would understand, and started to discuss. "Hey, let's talk business." Robb was so amused by Theon's words that he coughed again and said seriously, "In addition to the Dreadfort, the biggest reliance of the Bolton family is the mineral resources developed in Stony Irontown. Since the Dreadfort is like an iron turtle, we will go to Stony Irontown tomorrow and dig up this part of his foundation. He will only have 2 ways to go. Either he will come out to fight us for the future development of the Bolton family, or he will hide in the Dreadfort and wait for death slowly." Smart. Lord Robb is really smart. Why didn't I think of it when it's so simple? Well, actually, I was thinking that when I robbed the woman, I would also rob Stony Irontown. As soon as Robb finished speaking, the military tent was filled with praise from the officers. Listening to their exaggerated praise of the truth that even Chinese students could understand, Robb couldn't help but cover his face with his right hand, dismissed today's post-war meeting, and let them go down to rest. "Theon, stay. I have something else for you to do." Watching the officers walk out of the tent in 2s and 3s after hearing the meeting was adjourned, Robb called Theon. "Thank you all for voting and reading. This book has been promoted to the next recommendation. Please continue to vote and read. Thank you." Chapter 35 Kingting Island Red Wine. The next morning, the combined forces of Winterfell began to sort out their military tents and supplies, preparing to withdraw. The troops of Winterfell and Karstark were the first to evacuate, followed by the remaining reorganized militia infantry. Due to the large number of spoils and wounded soldiers, the logistics troops took the most time, so they set out last. But it turned out that Robb Bolton was just as Robb expected. Even if the logistics troops full of spoils and wounded soldiers were wandering in front of them, he had no intention of sneaking out of the city. This disappointed the cavalry troops led by Earl Rickard, who had ambushed behind the hills in advance. After marching for half a day, the mighty combined forces of Winterfell came to the fork in the road heading to Stony Irontown in the direction of Winterfell. Robb asked Theon and Owen to lead more than 3,000 archer infantry troops and escort 2,000 prisoners to Stony Iron Town. Although the logistics team brought a lot of food and supplies this time, it couldn't support so many mouths to feed. He gave Theon and the other two tasks. One is to occupy Stone Iron Town to supply the army. The other is to recruit 2,000 prisoners. Those who are willing to join the Winterfell army will be dispersed and incorporated into the militia infantry. Those who are unwilling will just be used as miners in Stone Iron Town to dig mineral resources for Winterfell. Robb led Elric, Little John, Eddard and others, and led most of the cavalry back first, on the grounds that the defense force of Winterfell was insufficient, and worried about accidents. After Robb officially issued the order, the army of Winterfell was divided into two at this fork in the road. On the third night after the siege of the Dreadfort, the smell of blood outside the city wall was still strong, and some rotten corpses that had not yet been processed added a strange feeling that made people's senses extremely uncomfortable to the dark night. Da-da-da. A faint sound of horse hooves awakened the sleepy bolt and defenders on the city wall. After the withdrawal of the Winterfell army, the nerves that had been slightly relaxed were tense again. A group of 300 to 400 cavalrymen holding torches and carrying the Bolton family emblem approached slowly. A closer look revealed that there were 3 slow-moving transport wagons in the group of cavalrymen. Although it was known that such a large number and speed of cavalrymen would not have any impact on the high walls of the Dreadfort, the officer in charge of guarding the city gate still sent someone to notify Lord Droros. After all, the military law of the Dreadfort was strict, and any negligence would be severely punished. Open the door quickly, I'm back. When the cavalrymen circled around to avoid the various piles of corpses and remains under the city wall and came to the castle gate, a cavalryman looked up and shouted. The officer guarding the city gate saw at a glance from the light of the other party's torch that this was Lord Droros' illegitimate son, Ramsay. Lord Ramsay, the Dreadfort is now under martial law. Without Lord Droros' order, we are not allowed to open the city gate privately. I have sent someone to inform him, and he will be here soon. Please wait. The officer did not dare to offend this cruel and petty bastard, and shouted at him in a polite tone. Ramsay did not get angry when he heard this, but smiled and nodded, waiting patiently. After a while, Droros came to the city wall, observed carefully for a while, and ordered the guard officer, mobilize 300 archers to guard the inner city wall. If they do anything wrong, shoot them immediately. Then open the city gate to a size that can allow the carriage to pass. Except for Ramsay, all soldiers entering the city must surrender their weapons at the city gate and be detained temporarily. Seeing the guard officer receiving the order and making arrangements, Droros did not think he was too cautious. He had seen too many lies and betrayals. When Ramsay waited outside the city gate, the smile on his face disappeared, and the Dreadfort's city gate finally opened a little bit. Of course, Ramsay had no objection to Droros' arrangement. After being disarmed by the soldiers guarding the city, he was the first to enter the Dreadfort. Father. As soon as he rode past the city gate, Ramsay saw Droros waiting for him. He immediately turned over and saluted. Well, did you encounter the army of Winterfell on your way back? Droros nodded and agreed, and immediately asked Ramsay. We did. The scout cavalry I sent discovered them in advance at the fork in the road to Stony Iron Town. There were about 7 or 8,000 people, and they were already lining up in a long queue to Stony Iron Town. After they all passed the fork in the road to Stony Iron Town, we hid for an extra day before we dared to come back. Ramsay nodded and directly told him what he encountered on the road. Alas, Stony Iron Town can't be saved. However, as long as we guard the Dreadfort, we will make the Stark family pay back double in the future. Hearing this, Droros sighed softly. His face was normal, but there was a hint of viciousness in his eyes. Father, I received a Raven letter before. Wasn't the war situation very good? How come the situation was suddenly reversed? I underestimated that wolf cub. I don't know, when he hid thousands of infantry in the military tents, and at the same time, concealed it from Loke's scout cavalry, and ambushed nearly 2,000 cavalry behind them. Hearing Ramsay's question, Droros briefly recounted the previous battle situation. However, as he spoke, his face, which was expressionless all year round, actually showed a little more sadness. As a well-known battlefield veteran in the north, He was very bitter in his heart to be calculated by a young man who had never officially led an army to fight. Father, as you said, as long as we defend the Dreadfort, we will have a chance to seek revenge on the Stark family in the future. Looking at Robb's rare sad expression, Ramsay immediately comforted him with concern. Well, what are those carriages loaded with? Robb quickly got rid of his emotions, looked at the transport carriages passing through the city gate, and asked Ramsay softly, Father, that was a caravan I robbed on my way back. It was full of the finest red wine from the arbor. These wines are not ordinary. The price in the north is much higher than in the south. It can be said to be flowing golden dragons. Oh, there are caravans transporting wine from the arbor to the north. Then I have to taste it. Hearing Ramsay's answer, Robb's eyes flashed, and he spoke softly. Father is right. I have to taste it. I will go to pour wine for you. Ramsay smiled and answered, then turned around and stopped the carriage passing through the gate and asked someone to open a wine barrel on the carriage. As soon as the barrel was opened, a fragrant wine aroma spread out. Robb first sniffed it with his nose, then looked into the barrel and saw the pink liquid in the barrel, which was rippling slightly due to the shock of opening the lid. This barrel of wine seems to have some impurities. Someone, open this barrel for me. Luce looked at the barrel and shook his head, not very satisfied. He called the soldiers to open another barrel he pointed at. After opening 3 barrels in succession, he seemed to have finally found the wine that satisfied him. Seeing this, Ramsay took out the wine glass from the cargo box of the carriage and filled it with wine for him personally. Father, please. Ramsay bowed his head respectfully, holding the wine glass, and offered it to Luce with both hands. Thanks to the early birds, why don't I have monthly tickets? Mark and other big people's monthly tickets. And also thanks to the readers, who insist on voting and reading every day. Chapter 36 begins. Ramsay, you have made the greatest contribution during this period. This batch of goods is also your spoils of war. You should be rewarded first. Robb shook his head, stared at Ramsay, and praised him sincerely. Hearing this, Ramsay immediately replied with some fear, for my father and the Bolton family, I don't work hard. Well, drink it. Robb nodded, raised his chin slightly towards the wine glass in Ramsay's hand, and gestured. Ramsay was moved, and put the wine glass in his hand to his mouth, and took a big sip. Well, it's really good wine. Father, I'll give you another glass. After swallowing the wine, Ramsay closed his eyes slightly, made an expression of aftertaste, and praised. Then, he immediately took another wine glass, and poured a glass of wine for Robb from the same barrel. He kept staring at Ramsay, and saw that he didn't show any abnormality. Robb slowly took the wine glass handed to him. Ramsay raised his unfinished wine glass with a smile on his face, and said to Robb, for Bolton. For Bolton. Robb also raised his glass to him, and took a sip of the wine in the glass. After drinking the wine, Robb suddenly exclaimed, and then said to Ramsay, the wine from the arbor is really delicious. It's their honor that you like it. By the way, where are the 4 cavalrymen from Winterfell? I want to let all the nobles in the north know that it was the feudal lord they are loyal to who robbed them. Even if I'm careless and suffer this time, I will not let that wolf cub have an easy time. Robb, who was tasting the wine, suddenly remembered something and asked Ramsay. Ramsay smiled without saying anything, turned his head, and pursed his lips and whistled, and a disarmed soldier entering the city nodded knowingly. A few minutes later, Sam and 3 wolf guards, who were bruised and tied tightly, were led to Robb by the soldiers. Very good. Ramsay, I'll leave this matter to you. I hope I can hear good news tomorrow. Robb knew that his illegitimate son was very talented in interrogation, so he spoke directly. Also, except for you, all the returning cavalry will be detained first, and released after their identities are verified. Do you have any objection? Yes, father. I have no objection. Ramsay nodded very obediently, looking like a well-behaved son. Seeing Ramsay's performance, Robb nodded expressionlessly, and walked to his room with his servants. Everything here has been arranged. Without his own order, Ramsay could not let the garrison officers do things for him. It took a long time for the more than 400 people led by Ramsay to check and disarm one by one and enter the Dreadfort. 3 transport carriages and nearly 400 war horses were placed in the stables on the right rear side of the gate. Usually, this place can accommodate nearly 1,000 war horses, but due to the heavy losses of the Bolton family cavalry, the stables are now empty, just right for placement. Just put the carriage in the stable. Don't worry about it. I will arrange for someone to unload it tomorrow. This is a flowing golden dragon. If you are rude and spill it, I can't compensate you, even if I peel your skin off. Seeing the guards preparing to unload the barrels of wine from the carriage, Ramsay frowned and stopped them. Hearing his voice, the guards stopped their actions in dismay, not daring to provoke this cruel bastard. Take the 4 of them to the interrogation room. Seeing that the guards stopped unloading his wine, Ramsay pointed at Sam and the other 4, and gave them an order, then turned and left. The guard officer frowned when he heard Ramsay's impolite tone, but still selected 4 guards. After whispering a few words to them, the guard officer asked them to take Sam and the other 4 to the interrogation room. Among the 400 cavalrymen under Ramsay, in addition to the nearly 100 who had been following him, the other 300 were left by Robbers at that time. When they were imprisoned, the guard officer took one of the cavalry out and asked the squire waiting nearby to take him away. The squire and the cavalry walked in the winding and damp corridor of the Dreadfort. Neither of them spoke, only the sound of footsteps. After twisting and turning for a long time, the squire brought the cavalry to Robbos's room. Lord Robbos. After the cavalry closed the door, he immediately saluted. Well, what has Ramsay done recently? Has he shown any abnormal behavior? Sitting in his seat, Robbos, who had been waiting for a long time, nodded and asked directly. Lord Ramsay, he robbed a caravan during this period and obtained a batch of wine. Maybe because the wine is valuable, he is in a good mood, so he directly let everyone in the caravan go. After hearing the question, the cavalry thought and recalled for a while, and then said, nothing unusual usually happens, but he often chats with the 4 cavalrymen from Winterfell, and they seem to be chatting happily. Well, where did you rob this caravan recently? Robbos carefully savored the cavalry's words, and did not think there was anything wrong, so he continued to ask. Lord Robbos, it wasn't recently, it was before the Dreadfort sent a raven to tell us that the Stark family declared war. What? In other words, Ramsay has been carrying these wines on his way back to help? Yes. Lord Ramsay would rather walk slower than give up this batch of expensive wines. Idiot. Why didn't you tell me earlier about such an unusual thing? Robbos, who has always been calm, seemed to smell the smell of conspiracy. He slapped the table and stood up and said loudly, there is something wrong with Ramsay, and there is something wrong with those wines. Let's go. In the interrogation room of the Dreadfort, Sam and the other 4 were tied to an X-shaped skinning rack, and 4 guards stood beside Ramsay. Okay, now it's time for me to have fun. You guys go out. Ramsay flipped through the various blood-stained torture instruments on the table in the interrogation room with his left hand, and waved to the guards with his right hand. Lord Ramsay, Lord Robbos asked us to report to him at any time, so. The 4 guards looked at each other after hearing what Ramsay said. One of the guards said with some embarrassment, okay, you stay here to report, and the others go out. I hate others staring at me when I'm having fun. Ramsay raised his eyebrows and said impatiently, yes. The 4 guards looked at each other again. The guard who spoke just now seemed to be the leader. He nodded to the others, and the other 3 guards filed out. Do you know? Weapons like this are the easiest to kill people. Ramsay searched on the table for a while, and found a sharp iron rod, as long as a dagger and as thick as a chopstick. He took it in his hand, and played with it, while saying to the guard next to him, I don't know. The guard was about to answer. Ramsay suddenly stretched out his left hand, and pinched his mouth into an H shape, and stabbed the guard's neck with a sharp iron rod in his right hand. The guard subconsciously grabbed Ramsay's left hand with both hands, trying to break free and scream. But as the sharp iron spike pierced his neck with bloody holes, his pupils gradually dilated in fear, his hands slowly drooped weakly, and his shouts became weaker and weaker. So, when I tell you to go out, you should go out obediently. Clearly feeling the guard's life slipping away, Ramsay poked the sharp iron spike into his neck, which was like a honeycomb and full of horrible bloody holes, for the last time, and did not pull it out. He grabbed the guard's linen lining with both hands, wiped the blood on the back of his hands with his lining, and smiled and spoke words full of persuasion. Although Sam and his friends were tied up and stuffed with cloth balls in their mouths, it did not affect their watching Ramsay's killing performance. At this moment, the four of them felt a little cold on their backs. Bang! After roughly wiping the blood off his hands, Ramsay let go of the guard's body and let it fall to the ground. He opened his arms and smiled at Sam and the other three, saying, "Everyone, Lord Robb's fireworks plan has officially begun. Thanks to the monthly vote from Miheoshu, I will start recommending it on the app today. I hope readers will continue to vote and read, so that we can keep going forward together. Thank you very much." Chapter 37 Late Fireworks. After Sam and the other four were released by Ramsay, they each found a handy dagger in the interrogation room. "Lord Ramsay, we will follow your instructions on how to act." Sam was not familiar with the layout of the Dread Fort at all, so he said to Ramsay in a sincere tone, "I will show you the way to the stables in a while. As for what to do next, I don't need to say more, right? I know. I hope Lord Ramsay will give us more time to avoid it. Don't worry, Lord Robb specifically told me to try my best to ensure your safety. Then I'll leave it to you." After a few simple exchanges, Ramsay and Sam and the other five confirmed that there was no one outside, so they opened the door and walked out. Along the way, under the leadership of Ramsay, they avoided patrolling guards and were safe. The interrogation room was below a garrison fortress in the city, not too far from the stables. A few minutes later, Ramsay pointed out the way to the stables to Sam at a window, then whistled and leisurely walked towards the upper wall. Sam and his four companions came to the stable carefully and found two soldiers of the Bolton family standing guard at the door of the stable, talking quietly. On the wall opposite the stable, an archer stood beside a burning brazier, on guard duty. Sam and his four companions observed carefully and found that there were two entrances to the stable, but both were guarded. The other entrance was close to the gate of the city wall, and there were more archer sentries on the wall. When Sam was thinking hard about how to sneak in, a wolf guard looked at the wall and patted his shoulder. Following his gaze, Sam looked over. He saw Ramsay smiling and waving to them at the archer sentry standing on the wall. The problem on the wall was solved, and Sam pointed to the two guards at the door of the stable. The two wolf guards nodded and moved towards them quietly. Sam, who was smart and flexible, was very self-aware and knew that he was not good enough. This kind of thing still needed professional personnel to do it. As expected, the guards at the door of the stable had no time to react and were cut in the throat by two wolf guards from behind. The two guards who were no longer struggling were dragged into the corner of the stable. After a while, the two wolf guards changed into guards' clothes and stood guard at the door of the stable. Sam and another wolf guard exchanged a glance and ran into the stable quickly. As soon as they entered the stable, they were hit by a foul smell. After all, hundreds of war horses were eating, drinking, defecating, and urinating in it, and the smell would definitely not be good. Sam and the other two frowned and covered their noses, and began to look for their target. After a few minutes, they found three conspicuous transport carriages. The two immediately stepped forward and fumbled for the wine barrels of the three carriages. Sam's right hand was gently groping along the lower half of a wine barrel. Suddenly, his fingertips touched a triangular raised mark. "Found it. It's my carriage. You watch it carefully. I'll go out and inform Ramsay." Sam looked up and whispered to the wolf guard and immediately turned around and walked towards the door of the stable. After walking a few steps to the door of the stable, Sam knocked gently. After the two wolf guards confirmed that no one was there, he walked out directly. On the opposite wall, Ramsay slightly modified the arrow in his hand while paying attention to the movement at the door of the stable. Seeing Sam come out and nod to him to indicate that everything was fine, Ramsay smiled and pointed to the castle gate. A few minutes later, a wolf guard drove a transport carriage, followed closely by Sam and two other wolf guards in guard clothes, and walked towards the castle gate. As the transport carriage moved forward, the archers on the wall also noticed the carriage, but interrogation and search were the work of the guards under the wall, so they just continued to pay attention. At the castle gate, the guards who were originally lazily leaning against it obviously also saw the carriage. They stood up straight and waited to interrogate the upcoming carriage. Sam, who deliberately chose a good position, pretended to support the carriage, and gently broke open the triangular mark of the wine barrel with his left hand. Suddenly, a stream of green and pungent liquid flowed down. After breaking the barrel mark, Sam turned his head and looked back at the left wall. Ramsay on the wall obviously saw his little action and nodded to him with a smile. "Ramsay, I've been looking for you for a long time. Come down, I have something to tell you." At this moment, Rose and the cavalryman arrived at the stable in the back. He looked up and saw Ramsay on the wall. Rose, who was quite cunning, did not directly call the guards to take him down, but kept a normal tone and called him loudly. Ramsay glanced at the familiar cavalryman beside Rose, and he smiled and laughed loudly. "Father, Lord Robb sends you the most sincere greetings." As soon as Ramsay finished speaking, he raised the special arrow that had been placed on the brazier and lit it, and drew the bow to shoot the arrow. Whoosh! When the gate guards were attracted by Rose's shouting behind them, Sam and his companions did not stop the carriage, but continued to move forward slowly. Sam, who had been looking back at Ramsay, took out his short knife from his sleeve. As soon as he saw him draw his bow, he thrust it into the thick buttocks of the horse pulling the carriage, and shouted, "Run!" Wow! The horse was in pain, and screamed as it rushed towards the city gate. The tightly bound wine barrel did not fall, but the barrel of wine flowing with green liquid flowed more violently as the horse ran. At the same time, the 3 wolf guards, including the driver, heard Sam's cry, and immediately dodged to the left and right, rolling and crawling to a place with thick cover. Rose, Ramsay, the cavalry, the archers on the city wall, and the guards at the city gate all stared at the rocket in the sky, which drew a perfect parabola. Wow! The burning arrow accurately hit the green liquid on the ground. Suddenly, a green flame ignited, like a snaking venomous snake, chasing the transport carriage that was about to reach the castle gate, and coming at a high speed. Boom! When the green venomous snake followed the traces on the ground to catch up with the transport carriage and entered the barrel of wine that was still flowing with green liquid, a violent explosion occurred. A green mushroom cloud, with the carriage that was immediately shattered as the center, spread rapidly in all directions. The gate guards, who were the first to bear the brunt, their flesh and blood and even most of their bones were directly melted in this extremely high temperature. This kind of flame is like a cancer attached to the bone. It will burn anything it sees, and is extremely difficult to extinguish. On the right wall, an archer who was relatively close was unlucky enough to be hit in the face by a green spark. But no matter how he screamed and slapped, the spark still stubbornly burned his flesh and flesh, until it burned a hole in his face and gradually extinguished. The gate of the Dread Fort is made of extremely thick oak, wrapped in a fine iron skin, and there are countless huge rivets nailed on the gate. But this gate, which once blocked countless enemies, was first blown to pieces by the violent explosion of the wine barrel, and then burned fiercely by the green flame, until it burned out. Outside the Dread Fort, in the dark night, Robb was waiting quietly in the dark night with all the cavalry. Suddenly, there was an explosion in the Dread Fort in the distance, and a green mushroom flame ignited at the same time. Looking at the beautiful and deadly green fireworks in the distance, Robb murmured, "It should have been set off in Winterfell a long time ago. It's a belated fireworks now. Thanks to the monthly ticket of the lazy guy who can't help me, and thank all the readers for voting and reading. P.S. I didn't go out to play on May Day, and I was writing. Please support this book. Thank you." If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story, and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 38 Victory. The green flames reflected in Lucy's pupils, which made him, who had always been calm, stunned and shocked. When he reacted, he suddenly pushed the cavalry beside him, pointed at Rams who had disappeared on the wall, and shouted loudly, "Bring people to catch that son of a bitch." Yes, my lord." The cavalry, who was also stunned by the green flames, wanted to take people to catch Rams immediately after reacting. But the guards at the gate were wiped out, and the soldiers patrolling and taking turns in the castle did not arrive so quickly. He pondered for a moment, then drew his sword and went to catch Rams alone. "If you don't want to die, Hurry up and ask someone to put out the fire. Luce felt a wave of heat before he approached the burning castle gate. He pulled up a soldier who was so scared that his legs were weak from the ground and shouted loudly. The soldier nodded blankly, ran towards the garrison fortress, and shouted for people to put out the fire. Da 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 da. Robb heard the sound of horse hooves from outside the city wall, and he immediately realized that it was the wolf cub outside the castle, leading the cavalry to wait for the green flame to go out. At that time, they could lead the troops into the Dreadfort without any hindrance. Fortunately, this difficult to extinguish green flame could buy Robb a lot of time, allowing him to make some arrangements to deal with the subsequent fierce battle. But then, through the gaps in the green flame, he saw the abnormal behavior of the Winterfell cavalry outside the city gate. Robb shook his head and sighed, then turned and walked towards the inner castle, and completely ignored the soldiers who were asking him how to put out the fire. Keep in line. Go. Outside the Dreadfort, Robb raised his hand and waved forward, and the cavalry behind him lined up in an orderly queue and rode towards the burning gate. Bang! When they were about to get close to the green flame, they took off a cloth bag tied to the warhorse and threw it forward with all their strength. The cloth bag made a muffled sound and hit the green flame. These stubborn green flames instantly ignited the cloth bags, and clumps of wet mud fell out of the burning cloth bags. Bang! 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 The cavalrymen of Winterfell threw away the cloth bags and rode away, letting the cavalrymen behind them continue the step. The whole process was orderly and well organized. As the number of wet mud bags increased, the green flames that could not burn the wet mud were gradually extinguished, and a road leading to the interior of the Dreadfort was formed. Charge. Those who surrender will not be killed. When Robb saw the crowd in the Dreadfort who were hurriedly putting out the fire and lining up in a hurry through the mud passage, he immediately gave the order to charge. Hot. Scalding. The cavalrymen of Winterfell covered their horses with blindfolds and drove them towards the wet mud passages that were still burning around them. When they rode through quickly, they could still feel the high temperature through their armor. Rip. Ah. When the Winterfell cavalry entered the city, there were only 100 soldiers gathered in the Dreadfort. After a charge, there were either corpses on the ground or wounded soldiers who were wounded by non-fatal sword wounds and fell to the ground wailing in pain. Lord Rickard, you take 200 people to guard here. Little John, Eddard, you take 1,000 people to attack the 3 garrison forts on the left, and the rest of you follow me to attack the fort on the right. Those who surrender will not be killed, and the wealth and women will be distributed uniformly after the war. Anyone who dares to ignore the order will be executed by me personally. After passing through the hot gate passage with the bloody wind and entering the Dreadfort that was easy to defend and difficult to attack, Robb immediately gave orders to everyone according to the pre-planned plan. Okay. I will guard the gate tightly. Yes. As you command, Lord Robb. The Winterfell generals around him nodded solemnly when they heard the order and began to take the troops assigned to them and act according to the order. Lord Robb. Sam, whose skin was severely burned, supported a wolf guard with a broken arm, limped out from a stone pair in the corner, and shouted to Robb, who was about to lead his men to attack. Medic. Treat them quickly, heal them at all costs. Robb saw Sam and the other 2 who were severely burned and looked like hounds, and his heart ached. He immediately shouted behind him. The medic with a linen head tied on his head and a wooden box on his body came out of the team and immediately stepped forward to treat Sam and the other 2. Where are the other 2 brothers? Robb looked behind Sam and asked with concern. After carefully handing the wolf guard's one-armed body to the medic, Sam looked sad when he heard Robb's question, with tears in his eyes, and shook his head weakly at him. Seeing this, Robb bit his gums hard and said to Sam, when I take down the Dreadfort, you will be the first to do the work. Everyone, follow me. Ah. With the scream of the last sword-wielding guard of the Bolton family, Robb captured the last garrison fortress on the right side of the Dreadfort. At this moment, he was covered in blood, both from the enemy and his own. This siege in the Dreadfort was completely different from the previous cavalry raid with favorable winds. Except for a small number of soldiers from the Bolton family who surrendered without a fight, most of the others fought bravely. Because they were familiar with the terrain of the Dreadfort, Robb was hit on the left arm by a sword at a corner of a corridor. However, with the blood-colored mist constantly pouring into his body, his left arm injured by the sword did not affect the battle at all. Just now, he took the time to check the wound, and it had stopped bleeding automatically. And the bloody wind beside him, although he was jumping around and eating snacks, it looked more seriously injured from the outside. Bloodwind had an arrow on his back, left leg, and left buttocks. He was attacked by the Bolton family archers. After all, Bloodwind's huge body made him the best target. However, it was also because he was concentrating on fighting that he was attacked from behind by the archers. Otherwise, with his eyesight and speed, he could have avoided the frontal shot. This time, because he was worried that the excessive influx of red mist would cause him to lose control, Robb gave Bloodwind all his blood points in advance, and during the battle, he added points in real time, whenever he had time. Currently, Robb's blood points remain at around 20, and Bloodwind's other 2 attributes are about to catch up with his physical fitness again. Robb, who completed the capture of the garrison fortress on the right, led the Winterfell soldiers, and escorted a few surrendered soldiers out of the castle. It was already early morning outside, and it turned out that they had been fighting all night without realizing it. As soon as he walked to the parade ground near the gate of the Dreadfort, Robb saw Jon and Eddard rushing with their soldiers, apparently wanting to reinforce him. Perhaps the resistance they encountered was not very fierce. Although the soldiers led by Little Jon and the others were also covered with traces of battle, they were not as embarrassed as Robb and his men. "We have won." Looking at the soldiers of Winterfell who were loyal to him and fighting for him, Robb clenched his right fist and punched it towards the sky, shouting loudly, "Whoa!" All the soldiers of Winterfell screamed at the same time. All of them were excited and held their heads high. The surrendered soldiers lowered their heads even more. Chapter 39 Transaction. On the parade grounds of the Dreadfort, a team of Winterfell soldiers were checking and verifying the identities of the surrendered soldiers and other prisoners one by one. The prisoners whose identities were confirmed would be assigned to the team guarded by other Winterfell soldiers to clean up the bodies and debris after the war. Robb sat in the back seat of an empty ox cart, and the paramedic was helping him treat the sword wound on his left arm. Next to him, there were 2 other paramedics helping Bloodwind, who was lying lazily on the ground, to pull out the arrow and clean the wound. Bloodwind certainly didn't want strangers to get close and touch him, not that Robb had been comforting him in his heart. Just the arrow pulling movements of the 2 of them that made Bloodwind whimper in pain were enough to make them snacks. "Have you found Drogo's Bolton?" Looking at Eddard who was doing the head count work on the parade ground, Robb tilted his head and asked Little Jon beside him. "It has not been found yet. We have sent a search team to look for it. Lord Robb, look over there." Little Jon, who was wearing full plate armor, spoke in a muffled voice. When he was answering Robb's question, he suddenly pointed to the right and said. Robb heard this and immediately looked in the direction of Little Jon's finger. He saw that a secret door was open under the right wall. Rose, with a dagger against his neck and his hands tied behind his back, was being escorted with a sullen face and walked towards Robb step by step. The one holding Rose with a dagger was his illegitimate son, Ramsay. Ramsay, with his signature smile on his face, greeted Robb with his free left hand when he saw Robb's eyes sweeping over. As the distance got closer and closer, Ramsay looked at Robb's face, which was still stained with blood, and the scene of their last meeting flashed before his eyes. In the dilapidated house in Hallwood, "Respected young wolf lord, your loyal hound greets you. Excuse me, is there anything you want me to do?" Robb, who was wearing a hooded cloak and hiding his face in the room, heard Ramsay's pretentious words. He pulled off his hood and chuckled, saying, "Hey, Ramsay, I may know you better than your father. Stop acting, let's talk normally. Lord Robb, your hound doesn't quite understand what you mean. You poisoned Lord Robb's eldest son, your brother, Demeric Bolton." Hearing Robb's sudden words, Ramsay's smile froze on his face. The air in the dilapidated house suddenly became quiet, and the 2 looked at each other in silence for a long time. The smile on Ramsay's face gradually disappeared, and he finally spoke expressionlessly. "I don't know where you heard this ridiculous rumor from. I just want to know why Lord Robb is so concerned about me. Well, if you say it's a rumor, then it's a rumor. I'll make a long story short, let's make a deal." Hearing Ramsay's denial, Robb shrugged indifferently and did not continue to answer his question, but went straight to the point. What deal? Hearing Robb talking about the point, Ramsay no longer entangled with the previous question and asked. Robb suddenly stood up, supported his hands on the tattered wooden table, leaned forward, and said softly, "You help me destroy most of the army of the Dreadfort, and kill Robert Bolton. I will make you the Earl of the Dreadfort, Ramsay Bolton. Ha ha ha. I'm my father's only son, and I will definitely inherit the Dreadfort in the future. Lord Young Wolf, do you think I'm a child? Trade with me with my own things." Ramsay did not fiercely refute or reject Robb's words about destroying the Bolton family army and killing his father. Instead, he was very dissatisfied with the reward that Robb proposed in the deal. Really? Lord Robbos is now in his prime, not to mention whether he can live to be 70 or 80 years old. Just say that, if he gets the mood one day, like the old beast of the Free family, and gives you 10 or 8 brothers, are you sure he will pass the title to you? HMM. Lord Ramsay Snow. Robb heard that Ramsay seemed to be determined to get the Dreadfort. He smiled and shook his head, and said in a light tone. This paragraph seemed to hit Ramsay. He did not speak immediately, but thought silently for a while, and asked, "The Bolton family is my foundation. You let me destroy most of the army. When the Dreadfort is in your hands, you can regret it, and kill me at will, right, Lord Robb?" "Ramsay, do you think I'm a fool?" Robb heard this, and immediately asked Ramsay back. "Of course not. I think you are wiser than the rumors say." Ramsay was a little caught off guard by Robb's words. Of course, he shook his head to deny it. Don't use the word wise. I don't like it very much. Anyway, as long as I'm not a fool, and as long as I want to continue to rule the North as a lord, I will not do this. Breaking the oath and murdering one's own meritorious officials is a smear on the honor of the Stark family for thousands of years. My father Eddard will never allow me to do this. Hearing Ramsay praising him for his wisdom, Robb frowned subconsciously, and then smiled and said, "When you betray your family and your father, then your only support is me. Since I'm not worried that you will betray me, and you are a very capable person, why would I want to kill you? I think we will become the most closely connected partners. I swear in the name of the new and old gods." Robb was smiling at first, but he became more and more serious as he spoke, and in the end he raised his hand and swore. I don't know if Robb's words are sincere, or if the names of Eddard and the new and old gods are very important. After hearing this, Ramsay smiled at Robb, then knelt on one knee, and said to him, "You are my king, from today on, until death." After hearing Ramsay's oath, Robb was moved. He walked around the shabby wooden table in front of him, and pulled him up. "From now on, we are like His Majesty the King and my father, both monarch and minister, and brothers. Yes, may I ask what you want from me this time? I heard from others that you have many spies and wide channels. I want you to help me find some wildfire through special channels, and then pack it in customized wine barrels. The faster and more secretive the better. As for the gold dragons for purchasing wildfire, I will let my trusted servants bring them. That's no problem. As long as there are gold dragons, everything is easy. Also, I want you to inform your father that I want to plunder." "Ramsay, good job. I will reward you for your contribution." Looking at Ramsay, who was approaching, and a little distracted, Robb spoke first with joy on his face. "Lord Robb, you are too polite. Everything is your credit." Ramsay came back to his senses, and replied with a respectful look on his face. Robb did not argue with him about the credit. He walked up, and patted Ramsay on the shoulder encouragingly. Then he turned to look at Robbers, who was in his custody, and said with a smile, "The Seven Kingdoms have always believed that our Stark family motto, 'Winter is coming,' is just a warning or threat. Well, now, winter is here, Lord Robbos. Thank you to the arbitration agency for the reward of 1,000 coins. Thank you to the extraordinary man for the monthly vote, and thank you to all readers for voting and reading. PS. Starting today, 2 chapters will be updated at the same time. Chapter 40, Aftermath. Oh, Robb Stark, you are young but wise, and you have both strength and power. My mistake was to underestimate you. However, can you trust this bastard who betrayed his family and his biological father?" Robbo said to Robb with a light laugh without smiling. Without waiting for Robb to answer, he did not turn his head, but moved his eyes to the left and back, and said to Ramsay who was holding him, "There are so many families loyal to Stark in the north, and they don't need the weak and disloyal Bolton family now. And since he can abandon thousands of infantry as bait, do you think he will hesitate when he needs to abandon you, my son?" Lord Robbos, as a famous northern earl of the same generation as my father, this kind of low-level provocation is completely inconsistent with your status. Come on, imprison Lord Robbos, and keep him well, and don't neglect him. Listening to his provocative words, Robb shook his head, answered with a disappointed tone, and called the soldiers to take him away and imprison him. Watching Robbos being taken away by several Winterfell soldiers, Robb turned to Ramsay and said, "Don't take his words to heart. When I return to Winterfell, I will formally send a letter to the northern nobles to enthrone you, Ramsay Snow, as the Earl of the Dreadfort. Thank you for the enthronement, Lord Robb." Upon hearing this, Ramsay bowed with a smile on his face, but when he lowered his head, his eyes were full of coldness instead of joy. Robb looked at Ramsay who was saluting respectfully, with a smile on his face as well, and a strange color flashed in his eyes. "Ramsay, you bastard. Didn't you say that we had time to evade? Give me back the lives of my two brothers." Suddenly, Sam, whose face and body were wrapped in clean linen bandages, with only his eyes exposed, rushed out from the side in great excitement, and stepped forward to beat Ramsay. Robb turned around and grabbed Sam's hands and said to him softly with an expressionless face, "Sam, take good care of your wounds. I will handle it. You can't blame me for this. My father's spies may have discovered the abnormality of letting all your people go when he took over the caravan wildfire. If I didn't shoot arrows to detonate the wildfire at that time, let alone capture the Dreadfort, I'm afraid our heads would have been stuck on the walls of the Dreadfort. You can still stand here and talk now. You should thank me." Ramsay stood up straight, shaking his head, and his words were full of Sam's gratitude to him. "You." Sam wanted to continue to refute, but he couldn't find any reason at all. Ramsay used the overall situation to pressure Sam. If he hadn't been an insider, the Dreadfort would have been difficult to capture. "Okay, Sam, you believe me. Take good care of your wounds. I will keep the two brothers in mind. I will definitely compensate their family well." Robb stared at Sam with sincere eyes and spoke loudly, which gradually calmed Sam's excitement. After Sam calmed down, he nodded to Robb, glared at Ramsay, and then bowed and left. "Lord Robb, please believe me, the situation was too urgent at the time, otherwise I would not have set off the wildfire so early. After all, you specifically told me to ensure their safety." Looking at Sam's back, Ramsay spoke to Robb with a sincere tone. "I believe you." Robb also stared at Sam's limping back, and did not turn around, but nodded and answered directly. But he said this unfinished sentence in his heart. "I believe you. Even if the situation is not urgent, you will directly shoot arrows to set off. The cleaning of the personnel and spoils of the Dreadfort is very time consuming." After sending a letter to Stony Irontown through the Dreadfort Crow's Nest, it only took most of the day for Theon to rush to the Dreadfort with 1,000 infantrymen. It can be seen that Theon, who was stationed in Stony Irontown for the past 2 days, has lived a very comfortable life. The whole person was rosy-cheeked and full of energy, as if nourished by a lot of love. As soon as he saw Robb, he immediately reported to him the details of Stone Irontown. Their army went to the entire Stone Irontown without any resistance at all. Under Robb's special order, Theon restrained the army very well, and did not carry out a devastating looting of Stone Irontown. Of course, all the mineral resources, wealth, and stockpiled food in Stone Irontown were confiscated by Theon and his team. Then, worried that the soldiers would cause trouble, he distributed the rewards for the victory of this war in advance through the military judge. The soldiers of Winterfell who received a large reward went to the red light district of Stone Irontown as soon as possible. By drinking and communicating with prostitutes, they vented the negative emotions accumulated on the battlefield. Well, the prostitutes in the past 2 days were in pain and happiness. Although they earned a lot of silver deer, they walked with their legs crossed and their waists supported. Of the nearly 2,000 captives of the Bolton family, only 1,500 were recruited, and the remaining 500 were directly used as mining laborers. They would be freed after working for 5 years. However, judging from the average life expectancy of miners in Stony Irontown, there should not be many left after 5 years. Among the 1,000 infantrymen brought by Theon this time, there were at least 300 Bolton surrendered soldiers. With the help of the additional manpower brought by Theon, the progress of the remaining cleanup work was greatly increased. 5 days later, there were basically no corpses outside the Dreadfort. The damaged part of the castle gate was repaired, and a new gate was installed. However, the charred marks on the wall were difficult to remove in a short time. Ramsay, while Sam is staying in the Dreadfort to recover from his injuries, I would like to trouble you to teach him how to develop secret agents and contact special channels. He will take over these dark and dirty things in the future. You just need to stand in the light and be a good lord. Under the new gate of the Dreadfort, Robb rode on his horse and explained to Ramsay, who was seeing them off. Of course, everything is as you wish, Lord Robb. Ramsay smiled when he heard this and replied, Sam, take good care of your wounds and study hard. Robb nodded, said to Sam beside him, and then ordered loudly, let's go back to Winterfell. Aboo. Knowing that he was about to go home, Bloodwind raised his head and let out a long howl. The mighty team in the Dreadfort began to return. First the cavalry team, and then the many Dreadfort prisoners being escorted. After them, there was a long dragon-like team of trophy carriages guarded and transported by the infantry team. It took more than half an hour for the long team to finally walk out of the Dreadfort. Seeing that his family's heritage over the years was gradually moving away from the Dreadfort, knowing that there were only a few resources left in the castle to maintain basic operations, Ramsay's smile gradually faded, thinking about how he should rule the territory in the future. Lord Ramsay, you have to be responsible for the revitalization of the Dreadfort and teach me, a fool. You will have a hard time in the future. Sam, whose linen bandage was still on his face, saw Ramsay's thoughtful expression and spoke in a sincere tone with a hint of sarcasm. Lord Sam, you're welcome. I still need your help in the future. After all, the 500 soldiers in the Dreadfort are all from Winterfell and only obey your orders. Ramsay was not angry when he heard this, but asked for help in a calm tone. You are joking. They are the guards of the Dreadfort and only obey your orders, Lord Earl. Haha, you are right. Haha. The two of them laughed heartily as they talked, but there was no smile in their eyes. Chapter 41 Triumph. Come here, decorate this place. It's uncomfortable to look at such a mess. Also, that place is too monotonous. Put some bright cloth strips to decorate it. In the main castle of Winterfell, in the banquet hall, Catelyn directed the servants with a ruddy face to arrange the messy tables and chairs and decorate the banquet hall with flowers, colorful cloth and other items. Hodder, who was huge and burly, held Brandon, who had woken up horizontally, and stood by and watched silently with an expressionless face. Rickon happily chased the shaggy dog, walking among the many servants, adding more chaos to the busy servants. Lady Catelyn, Lord Robb is about to arrive at the winter market. Let's prepare to welcome him in the parade ground. Mr. Luwin, wearing a bachelor's clothes and wearing a bachelor's shackles, walked in hurriedly and told the news reported by the soldiers. Hurry up and go to the parade ground to line up to welcome him after you are ready. Hearing that time was running out, Catelyn hurriedly urged the servants even louder. Click, click. Thousands of horses' hooves trampled on the wet soil, making tiny noises. Men, women, old and young in the winter market all stood on both sides of the road, looking at the cavalrymen passing by with excitement. They discussed in low voices from time to time about their majestic and neat military appearance when they marched in formation. Oh my god. The army trained by Lord Robb is so impressive, and their mental state is different from before. Of course, I heard 2 days ago that Lord Robb captured the Dreadfort. That could scare children to tears. This is the first time that the Dreadfort has been forcibly breached in thousands of years. Hey, isn't that Lord Robbos of the Bolton family? When he came to Winterfell with hundreds of cavalrymen, I saw him from afar. Such a big man is now in shackles and has become a prisoner. Rose, dragging heavy shackles and moving slowly forward, could of course hear the loud discussions of these damn civilians. He wanted to immediately pull out the tendons and skin these civilians, but he was unable to do so now. He could only hang his head and pretend not to hear. Snap. Bloodwind, who was walking in front of Robb, suddenly turned his head to avoid a small stone thrown from the left. He exerted force on his limbs and jumped over the heads of the civilians on the left. Run. I'm scared to death. Because Bloodwind was too oppressive, the civilians who had jumped over their heads screamed in fear and were ready to run away with their heads in their hands. Bloodwind. Hearing Robb's voice, Bloodwind opened his wolf mouth, revealing a mouthful of sharp teeth, and stopped his next move in front of a child's grey face. Whoosh, whoosh. Its ferocious wolf mouth, which was scary to look at, spewed out a white mist with a fishy smell, causing the trembling bear child in front of it to vomit. Egg. Lord, please have mercy. Among the civilians watching, a middle-aged woman who reacted suddenly rushed forward. She hugged the brat who dared to throw a small stone at Bloodwind, and begged for mercy with a series of wailing sounds. Come back. Bloodwind heard Robb's call, and before turning away, he stretched out his long tongue and licked the child's face with a very evil taste. Woo. Wow. The brat egg, who thought he was going to be eaten, was frightened and wet his pants and burst into tears. Feeling the teasing in Bloodwind's heart, Robb rolled his eyes unhappily, took out a silver deer from his arms, and bounced it to the middle-aged woman with a ding sound. The child is scared. Buy some delicious food to comfort him. Thank you. Lord, mercy, wealth, and health. The middle-aged woman saw that the child was spared and was rewarded with a silver deer and immediately spoke out poor words of praise. After this episode, the Winterfell army continued to move forward, but at this moment, the focus of the discussion among the civilians around was no longer the majesty of the army. It was the fierce Bloodwind, the merciful Robb, and the lucky mother and son. The entire triumphant return team stretched for several kilometers, but as long as they returned to Winterfell, Robb and other senior officials did not need to worry too much. The middle-level officials of Winterfell would naturally deal with the prisoners, the placement of the wounded, the storage and statistics of the spoils, and other miscellaneous matters. When they arrived at the parade ground, Mother Catelyn led everyone in the inner castle to set up the formation to welcome the king's arrival. Mother. Robb smiled and dismounted, shouted, and opened his arms to hug Catelyn. It's good to be back. This war, I have sent a raven letter to inform your father. He will be proud of you. Seeing the eldest son return unscathed, the sword wound on his left arm could not be seen. Catelyn's face was flushed, and she spoke happily. Mother, this time I used 4,000 people as bait, and more than 2,800 died. Robb was not happy when he heard this. He didn't need to pretend in front of his mother. He said softly with some guilt. They sacrificed their lives for their lords. You should let their families get the due reward. Catelyn stroked her eldest son's smooth hair and answered softly. I will. This time the harvest is far beyond imagination. After venting his inner fragility, Robb, who was in a much better mood, stood up and nodded. Well, that's good. Robb, you are much stronger than you think. Catelyn smiled and encouraged this eldest son who made her see the shadow of Eddard. Robb nodded and strayed to Hodder, looking at Brandon, whose face was still delicate, but whose eyes were no longer as smart as before. He kissed Brandon's chestnut hair distractedly. Bran, don't worry. Brother will make you recover. Robb, you should know that my legs can't be recovered. Brandon no longer called him brother affectionately, but was cold like a stranger, calling him by his name. Well, I know, but I will make you recover. Robb didn't care about his coldness and still answered with a smile. He told himself that he must make Brandon return to being the lively and happy boy and not let him become the so-called Green Prophet. He teased little Rickon again and comforted Jory, who returned to Winterfell to recuperate. Daisy, who had always obeyed his orders and was responsible for guarding Winterfell. Mr. Lewin, who was hard-working and did everything. Osha, who had nothing to do, and so on. After the hard work of comforting everyone one by one, Robb asked everyone to disperse and meet again in the banquet hall at dinner. Bloodwind's current size could not enter Robb's room, so it had its own room in the left corner of the first floor of the main castle, which could easily accommodate him. It was almost directly below Robb's room. This war lasted for more than half a month. Robb finally returned to his familiar solid wood bed, took a comfortable bath, and lay down to take a nap after being tired on the way home. When the servant woke him up, it was already sunset. After changing into the Lord's casual clothes that Catelyn had specially asked the servants to bring, the handsome and mighty Robb went to the banquet hall for the banquet. This banquet hall was a celebration and welcoming dinner that Catelyn had carefully prepared. There were all kinds of fruits, refined bread, and large pieces of meat. Robb, who was sitting on the main seat on the high platform in the banquet hall, knocked heavily on the long table twice, and then stood up with his wine glass. The discussion in the banquet hall stopped immediately, and everyone turned to stare at him. Tens of thousands of wildlings are still gathering strength outside the Great Wall. Tomorrow, we still can't relax in our training. But these have nothing to do with today. Today belongs to all of us. We are the winners. Enjoy your wine and food. Cheers. Cheers. Thank you to the arbitration agency for the reward and monthly ticket of 1,500 coins again. Thank you to Zahuji123, who likes early birds. I'm relaxing, and S voted for the monthly ticket. At the same time, thank you to all readers for voting and reading every day. Chapter 42 Recruitment. Theon, get up. It's almost time for training. In the banquet hall, Owen, who was dressed neatly and energetic, poured a pot of freezing cold water on Theon's face. My regards to your mother. Theon, who was lying on the long table and dreaming about the harem, was shocked by the cold water and jumped up suddenly. He was dazed and just said a polite greeting. Lord Robb has gone to the training ground. Do you know what the punishment is for being late? Everyone else has left, and I'm the only one who wakes you up. Shouldn't you thank me? Owen looked at Theon jumping around like a monkey, shaking off the cold water on his body. He smiled in his heart, but said seriously on his face. Hearing this, Theon looked around the banquet hall. He saw many servants cleaning up the extremely messy banquet hall. It was indeed the only two officers of Winterfell who were still there. Thank you, Owen. Let's go quickly. I don't want to do the embarrassing and uncomfortable frog jump around the parade grounds like before. But why does my right face hurt so much? Theon hurriedly called Owen and walked out of the banquet hall. At the same time, he asked Owen, while pressing his tongue back and forth on his painful right face. You really don't have any memory of last night? You were too happy yesterday, and you dragged Robb to find the red-haired drows, saying that you wanted to play a group walk. Then, Lady Catelyn rewarded you by giving you a gentle massage on your right face. Haha. Owen, who had a serious expression, couldn't help laughing when he thought of the scene of Theon being slapped in the face last night. Knowing that I was drunk, you still hit me so hard. Oh, stop laughing. Let's go. Knowing that he was hit by Catelyn, Theon stroked his right face and muttered, then rolled his eyes and dragged Owen, who was laughing non-stop, to the parade grounds. Today, the soldiers' training in Winterfell was carried out normally and was not affected by yesterday's revelry. The prisoners and wounded were properly settled in batches by the middle-level officials of Winterfell yesterday. The rewards such as spoils of war, military merits and death compensation are still being counted, and it will take a few days to come out. After the morning training, Robb rushed to the meeting hall to deal with the territory affairs that had been piled up for more than half a month. Master Luwin, that's about it for today. In my name, you will send Draven letters to all the nobles in the north and ask them to come to Winterfell to collect the looted goods. At the same time, post a notice at the gate of Winterfell. As long as you can prove that you are the owner of the goods of the victim caravan, you can come to collect it. It took half a day to finally deal with the accumulated affairs, and Robb gave his order to Maester Luwin beside him. Okay, I'll do it now. Nodding in response, Maester Luwin turned around and went to the crow's nest. Robb was talking to Daisy, who was still fulfilling her personal guard duties, about whether Brandon had any abnormal behavior recently. The guards in the meeting hall came to report that a soldier from Winterfell came to report the situation. Lord Robb, the little devils from the Lannister family have arrived at the winter market and are heading towards the red light district. Lord Theon is following them. He asked me to ask you if we need to take them down. A soldier in armor reported to Robb immediately after entering the meeting hall. Robb, who knew Tyrion, shook his head and said, "Let Theon invite them here." Politely. "Yes, sir." The soldier took the order and turned away. Not long after, the four little devils were invited by Theon. I just went to the wall to pee, and when I came back again, it felt like a long time had passed. Winterfell has changed so much, don't you think, Lord Young Wolf? Tyrion joked with a playful smile as soon as he saw Robb. Little devil, you'd better be respectful to the Lord. Otherwise. Hearing his tone, Theon frowned and warned. Tyrion smiled and answered fearlessly, how about that? Chop me into smaller pieces for your master? You. Okay, Theon. It must be said that Tyrion, who looks like a playboy, has already maximumed out his skills in taunting. Seeing that Theon was easily angered by Tyrion, Robb raised his hand to stop them from going on. Tyrion Lannister, I found a secret letter from a great man in the West in the Bolton family. Are you interested in reading it? Aha. From what you said, I know without reading the letter that the writer must be my father who likes to plot everywhere. He just saw that Lord Eddard went to King's Landing and you just took over Winterfell, so he wanted to incite the Bolton family to create some trouble for you. But who knew that you would defeat Rose Bolton and capture him directly? Tyrion was indeed a smart man. He understood everything at once, but he said it directly in front of everyone without any reservation. Seeing such an interesting Tyrion, Robb was immediately interested and threw away his original words. He said directly, Tyrion, your debauchery is just a disguised shell because of the discrimination of the family. Of course, you like and enjoy this shell, but you are actually a very wise, kind-hearted pseudo-evil. Wow. Lord Robb, your comments make me not know how to respond. I didn't even know that I was such a great person. As soon as Robb finished speaking, Tyrion continued to smile and said in an exaggerated tone, but his slightly flustered eyes showed that these words had a certain impact on him. Tyrion, join the Stark family. I will make you my deputy and give you a platform to display your talents. No one can command you to do anything except me. You are so smart, you should be able to tell whether I sincerely invite you. Seeing that Tyrion was caught off guard by his words, Robb continued to increase the stakes and spoke loudly to him. As soon as he finished speaking, the entire meeting hall fell into silence. No one expected that Robb and his partner would directly talk about such an important matter on such an occasion. Tyrion could feel the sincerity in Robb's words, so he, who was always eloquent and eloquent, could not help but stand there in a daze, not knowing how to continue the conversation. Behind him, two guards wearing angry lion armor from the Lannister family looked at each other silently. The two felt that after hearing such words today, they would not be able to leave the meeting hall. But they were not willing to surrender, and they all understood from each other's eyes that they wanted to fight to the death. And the Night's Watcher Avenyoran, who had been invisible at the side, was watching the development of this drama with a meaningful expression. As the hands of the two Lannister guards slowly reached for the hilts of their long swords, Tyrion, who had recovered from his shock, laughed loudly. Lord Robb, as you said, I'm just a dwarf discriminated against by the Lannisters. No matter what your intention is, I beg you not to waste so much energy on me. It's not worth it. Tyrion, remember what I said today. I will be your best choice at the end of your life. By the way, you can stay in the guest room of the main castle today, or the same room you stayed in last time, okay? No need to bother you this time. The girls outside the city must miss my silver deer, and the little lion. Haha. Tyrion said, and then bowed and left. When he turned around, his face was as gloomy as water. He followed the two Lannister guards behind him, who were obviously relieved, and walked out. The Night Watchman Yoren also bowed to Robb, and turned around, and walked out without saying a word from beginning to end. Chapter 43, Butterfly Wings. Robb, although the little devil is despised by the Lannister family, they are of the same blood after all. You recruited him, isn't it the same as inviting a hungry lion into the sheepfold? Looking at Tyrion and others leaving, Theon was the first to lose patience. Didn't he agree? You let people spread the news about this. So, you are not sincere in recruiting him. I understand. I will do it now. I'm sincere in recruiting him, and hope that he will agree. What a pity. Looking at Theon, who looked much more relaxed, Robb sighed in his heart. Outside the meeting hall, Yoren walked up quickly and said to Tyrion, who was thinking with his head down, Lord Eddard's son is not simple. I can feel that he was serious about recruiting you just now. You have always been looked down upon. Now someone values your talent. Shouldn't you be happy? Well, I can also feel that he is recruiting me sincerely. That's why I can't be happy. I always feel that this matter is not that simple. He seems to know me very well. He just said with certainty that he will be my best choice when I'm at the end of my road. The North will definitely get better and better under his control, but I don't know whether it is good or bad for the other 6 countries. Tyrion, who was whispering in thought, suddenly scratched his head, which was a little troubled by lack of information, and said to Yoren, "Hey, why are we thinking so much here? Let these lords play their own power games, and we will play the adult games we like." I said I would treat you well at the Black Castle. Let's go. Lord Yoren. Today in Winterfell, dozens of ravens flew to various places with letters. The prostitutes in the red light district received a large number of silver deer rewards, and the civilians in the winter market lived as usual. In King's Landing, Sir Rodrik rode his warhorse and slowly merged into the crowd, passing through the old, mottled, narrow and crowded old city gate. Entering the long-lost King's Landing, looking at the bustling crowd, Sir Rodrik stood in the center of the street, thinking in his heart how to find Lord Eddard to quietly report the situation. "Sir Rodrik, Lord Eddard asked me to inform you to come with me to meet him." A soldier wearing a robe made of thick wool, dyed golden, and black armor on the outside rode a warhorse to him and whispered, "HMM." Looking at this soldier of the capital garrison, commonly known as the Golden Robe, Rodrik asked in a doubtful voice, "Hand of the king, Lord Eddard?" After the soldier nodded to confirm, he turned around and led the way. Rodrik thought for a moment and then drove his horse to follow. Not far to the left from the old city gate, the two turned into the famous red light district, Silk Street. This street has various high-level and low-level technical academies. At this moment, both sides of the street are young prostitutes wearing light gauze and showing off their graceful figures without hesitation. Sir Rodrik has seen all kinds of scenes in all these years. He followed the leading soldier expressionlessly and without looking away. After a while, the two came to a 2-story high-end technical academy built of stone. After the two entered through the main entrance openly, the leading soldier stopped at the door of a room on the 2nd floor. Rodrik pushed the door open and found that in this room, decorated with exotic style and luxury, Ed was waiting for him with a handsome and elegant middle-aged man. "Lord Eddard, Lord Baelish, Lady Catelyn asked me to." Rodrik greeted the two of them when they met. He knew the middle-aged man next to Eddard, the Minister of Finance Petty Baelish. "Kate asked for Lord Baelish's help, so that we can meet here." Eddard glanced at Baelish next to him and said a few words. Rodrik, who had followed Eddard for a long time, certainly knew that Lord Eddard disliked Baelish very much. "Lady Catelyn did not mention this when I set out." Rodrik heard this, nodded, and said with some doubt, "Ravens are always faster than humans. I just received a letter from Kate a few days ago. I can't refuse her request at all." Baelish didn't care about Eddard's expression at all, and said with a smile, "Well, what did Kate ask you to do?" Eddard didn't want to stay in the same room with Baelish for a long time, so he asked directly, "Lord Eddard, someone tried to assassinate Brandon with a dagger, made of Valyrian steel. So, Lady Catelyn thinks that Brandon's fall from the ruined tower was not accidental." Rodrik asked directly after hearing the question. "Assassinated Brandon? Daggers made of Valyrian steel are very rare, so it should be easier to track down." After listening to Rodrik's story, Eddard thought about the clue of the dagger and said softly, "Eddard, there is no need to track down. I'm the only one in the 7 kingdoms who owns a Valyrian steel dagger. You? Yes, but on Prince Joffrey's name day, I lost the dagger to Tyrion Lannister." Tyrion Lannister? Hearing the clues provided by Baelish beside him, Eddard recited Tyrion's name thoughtfully. "By the way, how is Winterfell? What is Robb's attitude towards this matter?" When Rodrik left Winterfell, the war had not yet begun. When he heard Eddard's question, he replied, "Winterfell was governed very well by Robb. He told Lady Catelyn that this matter was not that simple, and we could not easily draw conclusions." "Very good, let's not draw conclusions so quickly, and continue to investigate this matter. Rodrik, thank you for your hard work. Please help me take this letter back to Winterfell, and give it to Catelyn." "Yes, Lord Eddard." After Eddard handed the letter in his arms to Rodrik, the two left his advanced technical academy with Baelish's smile. Seeing that the two had disappeared at the corner of the street, Baelish's face suddenly darkened. He bit his lips and thought about how to deal with the next thing. After thinking for a long time, Baelish, who felt that the plan in his mind was completely feasible, nodded secretly and turned to go upstairs. He wrote a secret letter to his lover, Lysarin, who was far away in the Eyrie. Tyrion and his 4 companions, who stayed in Winterfell for 2 days, presented Robb with a special riding equipment design, and then set off directly to King's Landing. When seeing the design drawings, Robb nodded secretly for Tyrion's inventiveness. In order to avoid any accidents, when Tyrion returned to King's Landing, he proposed to send a team of Winterfell cavalry to escort them. But I don't know if Tyrion didn't want to be too deeply involved with Robb and decisively rejected his kindness. Robb thought that Catelyn was still in Winterfell, and he also repeatedly emphasized to Sir Roderick that before there were enough clues to identify the murderer, no conclusion could be easily drawn. Therefore, there should be no accidents when Tyrion was at the crossroads inn. At noon that day, Tyrion and his 4 companions set off from Winterfell and returned to King's Landing. Thanks to Xinhuang Yishi for the reward. Thanks to Wei W. Still Naked, Book Friend 201905141700006278, Mieju, and Raphael Cantus for the monthly votes. At the same time, thanks to all the readers for voting and reading every day. Chapter 44 Information. The many ravens released by Winterfell soon reached the crow nests of the northern nobles and completed their mission of delivering the letter. White Harbor, Manderley family, Newcastle study. Lord Wyman looked at the letter in his hand, so shocked that his jaw dropped and his mouth wide open for a long time. Mr. Theomer, is this letter true? Lord Robb not only destroyed most of the Bolton family's army, but also captured the Dreadfort, which had never been conquered. Hearing his lord's question, Mr. Theomer showed a wry smile and replied, Lord Wyman, I had the same reaction as you when I saw the letter. However, there have been various rumors for some time. Some said that he was a deserter from the Bolton family and was chased by the Stark family cavalry. Some said that the Bolton family's Stone Eaton was occupied by the Stark family. There are also reports that the Dreadfort was on fire. The elderly Mr. Theomer paused for a moment, took a breath and continued, with these many rumors, plus this letter with the Lord's seal, I think this matter should be true. Incredible. Lord Robb is incredible. Sure enough, the child of a fierce wolf cannot be a docile dog. Earl Wyman was very excited, and his hands kept moving while he spoke. He seemed to remember something, and continued to ask Mr. Theomer, is the ship of mere ointment coming soon? Yes, judging by the time, we should be able to reach White Harbor in the next 2 days. Very good. Didn't our White Harbor caravan get robbed? It just so happens that I will personally take this batch of mere ointment to Winterfell. Lord Wyman, I will make your travel arrangements right away. Well, during my absence, Willis will take care of the affairs of White Harbor. Please teach him more. Yes, sir. Due to the difficulty of communication in the north and the lack of information, communication basically relies on ravens. Therefore, when most of the noble families in the north first received the raven letter from Winterfell, they did not dare to believe the content on it. However, the letter was engraved with the seal of the Lord of the Stark family. Most families were skeptical and either went there in person or sent family representatives to head towards Winterfell. Casterly Rock in the west. Casterly Rock is a tall and magnificent rock castle located on the western coast of Westeros, overlooking the prosperous Lannisport and the vast Sunset Sea opposite. The castle was carved on a huge rock, and the walls and other buildings built on it made the castle's defense more powerful. Of course, it is precisely because of the overall rock structure of the castle that it is very troublesome to dispose of human waste. However, under the redescent of the clever Tyrion, a well-planned cleaning system that discharges waste directly to the sea has made the Lannisters no longer worry about it in recent years. Like the Dreadfort in the north, Casterly Rock has never been forcibly captured by the enemy in historical records. At this moment, in the stone garden in the castle, Tywin Lannister, the Guardian of the West, who maintains an elegant demeanor, is leaning comfortably on the chair, tasting the golden wine of the Arbor Island in his mouth, and admiring the beautiful sunset scenery in his eyes. Wearing a golden noble casual dress embroidered with the Angry Lion family emblem, Kevan Lannister, who is in his 50s, walked towards him quickly with the raven letter in his hand. What bad news is it again? Tywin, who knows his brother very well, saw the expression on his face and asked directly. A spy sent a letter saying that the wolf cub from the north has captured the Dreadfort and captured Robb Bolton and brought him back to Winterfell. He plans to support Robb's illegitimate son, Ramsay Snow, as the new lord of the Dreadfort. Having served as his brother's deputy for many years, Kevin certainly knew what was important, and he told him the breaking news right away. What? How long has it been? Robb Bolton was defeated just like that? He was captured by a kid whose hair hasn't even grown out yet? Tywin sat up straight after hearing the news. Due to his intense movements, a lot of the expensive wine in his glass spilled. Yes, we all underestimated this wolf cub. The spy said that he saw through Robb's battle plan completely, and he was calculating Robb's every step of the way. Oh, this is bad. From now on, the North will become a complete iron plate, and it will never be easy to intervene again. Those barbarians in the North rarely go south. Why do you care about them? Hearing Tywin sigh, Kevin asked with some confusion. Stark is a staunch supporter of Baratheon. If in the future, Tywin put down the wine glass in his hand, looked at the setting sun that was gradually sinking into the sea level in the distance, and said in a low voice, "What in the future? Nothing. You will know later." Yeah. Kevin, who has always admired his brother, never asked more questions as long as Tywin didn't want to say it. He remembered the doubts when he saw the raven letter, so he changed the subject and asked, "The spy we took the trouble to plant before, wasn't it pulled out by that wolf cub? Where did such detailed information come from now?" Cersei and Jaime accompanied the king to Winterfell before, and this spy was their work. It is very useful, and reported to me a lot of secret information about Winterfell. Speaking of his children, Tywin showed a little smile on his face. It can be seen that he is very satisfied with their work of planting the spy this time, as expected of our Lannister twins. By the way, the spy's letter mentioned at the end that the wolf cub tried to recruit Tyrion in Winterfell. Tyrion did not agree, but gave him a set of riding equipment design drawings. Kevin praised casually and continued to report. Recruit him? The wolf cub wants to drive a nail among us Lannisters? Tyrion will never agree. Although I never think he is a Lannister, I have to admit that he has a Lannister smart brain. Then what should we do next? Send someone to send a letter to the nobles in the north to test the waters. Earl Wyman of White Harbor is a shrewd businessman. I think we can talk business with him. Then, send a letter to Cersei, asking her to teach Joffrey more and control the eldest daughter of the Stark family as soon as possible. In King's Landing, the royal meeting had just ended, and several ministers bowed to Eddard, who was sitting in the main seat, and left. When Eddard also stood up to leave, Grand Maester Purcell, who had not left yet, stopped him. Lord Eddard, I almost forgot that there is a raven letter from your Winterfell." The old Maester stuttered slowly, and took out the letter from his arms. "Thank you, Maester Purcell." Eddard thanked him, and took the letter and unfolded it to read. However, the more he read the letter, the more he frowned. "Lord Eddard, your son is really brave and good at fighting. Congratulations." Maester Purcell, who had obviously read the letter in advance, complimented Eddard. Hearing this, Eddard put away the raven letter, turned his head to look north, shook his head, and said something meaningful. "Among wolves, the first to attack is indeed the most courageous, but it is also the easiest to die." Sam, who was pot-bellied and walked with a sense of humor, walked through the Black Castle with a smile on his face. When he saw Jon, who was cleaning with a grim expression on his face, he immediately said, "Jon, there is a raven letter saying that your brother led the army to capture the Dreadfort and captured Lord Robb alive. Did Robb win the battle? What else did the letter say?" Jon asked with a happy face after hearing Sam's words. "Nothing else. It seems that they asked Castle Black to strengthen its vigilance, saying that a large army of wildlings is gathering outside the wall." After Sam answered the content of the letter, he asked Jon with a naive face, "Jon, I heard that your brother is called the Young Wolf. Tell me what kind of person he is." Hearing Sam's question, Jon thought of Robb when he left Winterfell, and said, "In fact, I don't know what kind of person he has become now, but in my heart, he is a good brother who will protect his family and his home." If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 45, Northern Nobles. Da da da. A cavalry team with a male mermaid flag holding a trident, escorting a gorgeously decorated carriage and more than 10 transport carriages, is about to arrive at the south gate of Winterfell. Earl Rickard, who received the news in advance and was in charge of the welcoming work, saw the cavalry team from a distance. He rode his son and the welcoming guard of honor to meet them. Haha, isn't this the carriage of Lord Too Fat to ride? Why don't you come out to meet your old friend? Earl Rickard, who was upright and generous, shouted loudly as he approached the gorgeous carriage. Stop. Hearing the rough shouts outside, the people in the carriage stopped the carriage and opened the door. Earl Wyman, who was fat and plump, dressed in brightly colored noble casual clothes made of expensive fabrics, got out of the carriage. He angrily hit back at Lord Rickard. Lord Robb asked you, a rude barbarian, to do the welcoming work at Winterfell. Aren't you afraid of offending all the northern nobles? Listening to the familiar teasing of his old friend, Lord Rickard turned over and dismounted with a smile on his face. He walked forward a few steps, and the two opened their arms and had a very heavy bear hug. Ha ha ha, big fat man, long time no see. Long time no see, rude barbarian. After a round of heavy punching between men, to reminisce about the past, Lord Rickard simply let his son lead his warhorse, and he comfortably got into Lord Wyman's luxurious carriage and continued to move towards Winterfell. Big fat man, White Harbor is not too far from Winterfell. Why did you take so long to get here? Lord Rickard took a bunch of grapes from the plate in the carriage without any hesitation and asked while eating. Of course, Lord Wyman would not mind his old friend's rude behavior. He replied with a smile, to wait for the goods ordered by Lord Robb, which are the things on the transport carriage behind. Oh. Huh. Why are you not curious about what it is? Seeing his old friend answer perfunctorily and then concentrate on eating grapes, Lord Wyman asked in surprise. During this time with Lord Robb, I have learned to do more and not ask too many questions. I don't want to know what he plans. Lord Rickard shook his head and answered, then put down the grapes in his hand, approached Lord Wyman and whispered, he is completely different from Lord Eddard who likes to fight head on. Rose Bolton, who is good at calculating, was calculated by him, and the Dreadfort fell, and he was captured. As an old friend, I remind you that Winterfell is now completely different from before. Don't have any delusions in your heart, and be content with your own duties. Wyman listened carefully with a serious face, knowing that his old friend had a fairly shrewd mind under his rough appearance. Even he was a little afraid of the young Wolf Lord. It seemed that Winterfell had indeed changed a lot during this period. Haha, don't you know me yet? I just want to do business in peace. Yes, I know you, a fat man, are very loyal to Lord Eddard, and will definitely not have any delusions. Of course, by the way, I heard that your two sons are both in the Wolf Guard, and are now senior officers in Winterfell. Hehe, that's right, don't you look at who their father is? The two old friends in the carriage chatted, and gradually entered Winterfell. Due to the large number of noble earls and representatives of noble families from the north, who have come recently, the guest room area of the main castle has been full. Earl Wyman and his party were placed in the guest room building on the left side of the parade ground. The guest room was originally prepared by Winterfell for a large number of guests. The rooms in the whole building are enough to accommodate all the guests, but the overall accommodation conditions are definitely not as good as those in the main castle. Earl Wyman was still quite familiar with the rules of Winterfell. He was well prepared. He waved his hand and let a large group of servants holding various things enter the room to reorganize. The servants had all the things prepared in advance, including various animal fur blankets, gold and silver lamps and tablour, fine wine, and delicious food. In a few minutes, they decorated the relatively simple guest room luxuriously and comfortably. This made Earl Rickard, who had always been in a bad financial situation, envious. If the servants of Winterfell had not informed him that the dinner time had arrived, he would have wanted to stay in Earl Wyman's room and enjoy the fine wine and delicious food. The banquet hall, the decorations made for the triumphal dinner before had not been removed, and they were reused this time. When Wyman and Earl Rickard entered the banquet hall, they found that the long table in the hall was full of many northern nobles who were discussing loudly. Earl Wyman saw some old acquaintances, such as a middle-aged woman with grey hair, short stature but very strong. She was the ruler of Bear Island, Maggie Mormont, captain of Robb's personal guards, Daisy's mother. A tall man of nearly 7 feet tall, his exposed body was full of thick muscles. He looked ferocious, but at this moment he was smiling and praising his son loudly. He was the Earl of Last Hearth, John Umber, known as Big John, the commander of the Winterfell cavalry and the father of Little John. He was a little old man wearing leather armor embroidered with 6 Thistle family emblems, with messy long hair, wrinkled face, but extremely sharp eyes. He was the patriarch of the Nor clan, Earl Nor, the commander of the Winterfell infantry, and Owen's uncle. After his careful observation, Earl Wyman discovered something interesting. Among the northern nobles present, except for the families whose descendants served as senior officers in Winterfell and the rulers of the territory came in person, only the Earl of Severn, who was closest to Winterfell and only half a riding day away, was present. The rest of the northern noble families basically sent representatives. From a certain perspective, this shows that some northern noble families still have many doubts about the young wolf's capture of the Dreadfort and the capture of Rose Bolton. Before Lord Wyman could think about it, Lord Rickard pulled him and squeezed into a long table to sit down. When Lord Wyman chatted with Lord Severn, who was kind and well spoken, the banquet was about to begin. Lady Catelyn appeared on the high platform of the banquet hall with Brandon and Rickon, who were carried by others. All the nobles who are loyal to the Stark family, on behalf of the Stark family, I sincerely welcome you. The initiator of this banquet is the acting Lord Robb Stark, but he is in the military camp outside the city, preparing for the military parade tomorrow, so he was unable to attend. I apologize for this. But these cannot stop us from drinking wine enthusiastically tonight and enjoying the food. Now, the banquet officially begins. As Catelyn's voice fell, the door of the banquet hall opened, and a row of servants came up with novel delicacies. Wyman was still thinking about the military parade that Catelyn had just mentioned, but in a blink of an eye he was attracted by the novel delicacies on the table. This dinner really redefined what food is for Earl Wyman, who has eaten delicacies from all over the world. There are whole chickens wrapped in mud, which smell fragrant when opened, and pork slices full of chili peppers and finally drizzled with boiling oil. There is also a strange soup pot that uses a pot to cook various ingredients, and makes people sweat. According to Earl Rickard, who swallowed the food in big mouthfuls, he said vaguely that these were all invented by Lord Robb. Earl Wyman, who also had a mouthful of food, felt that Winterfell had indeed changed a lot. Thanks to the arbitration agency, Book Friends 20210610132324504, and Shuanshan for their monthly votes. At the same time, thank all readers for voting and reading every day. P.S. After a few chapters of the plot transition chapter, it is the next important plot. You can guess according to the timeline. Chapter 46 Military Parade. The next morning, all the nobles in the north were awakened by servants in advance. As soon as the sky was bright, everyone rode horses or took carriages to the military camp a few kilometers away from Winterfell. We are here. Over there is the newly built Winterfell military camp. Earl Wyman, who was catching up on his sleep in the carriage, was awakened by Earl Rickard before he had slept for long. Earl Wyman rubbed his eyes and looked through the window in the direction he pointed. A wooden fence made of sharpened tree trunks appeared in the field of vision, surrounding the military camp. From the outside, it can be seen that this military camp is very simple, but it was built in a flat and vast open space. Judging from its area, it can accommodate at least thousands of soldiers. What is that? Earl Wyman pointed to a tall building in the shape of a dagger, made of bluestone and yellow mud, next to the simple military camp. Compared with the simple military camp next to it, this building was obviously carefully designed and built. I don't know. Lord Robb personally supervised the construction. I said yesterday that I would not ask any more questions unless he told me. Lord Rickard scratched his head and shook his head. In such a short period of time, it must have cost a lot of gold dragons to build the barracks in this building. How many civilians were recruited in total? Lord Wyman, who was good at business, was more concerned about the construction cost. Well, Lord Robb spent twice the price to recruit civilians. At that time, the civilians in the winter market rushed to work like crazy. Twice? Why? Even if the price was less than half, the civilians could not refuse. Hearing Lord Rickard's answer, Lord Wyman frowned and said, a little confused. Well, Lord Robb said something very strange at that time. Money circulation, stimulating domestic demand seemed to be these words. Anyway, I didn't understand. Rickard thought for a moment, imitated Robb's tone, and emphasized two words. When Lord Rickard finished speaking, these words that he did not understand made Lord Wyman fall into deep thought. The carriage became quiet because of this topic. After a while, the carriage team of the northern nobles entered the newly built spacious military camp. When they arrived at the destination, the northern nobles dismounted and looked at the newly built military camp of Winterfell. This is a standard rectangular military camp with an entrance and exit in the north and south directions. In the east, where the rising sun is now, a bluestone platform as tall as an adult was built, and on both sides of the platform were stepped stands similar to the stadiums in the previous life. There were brand new wooden seats on the stands. In the west of the military camp were rows of neatly arranged thick military tents. At this time, the commander of the Archers of Winterfell, Theon Greyjoy, stood on the platform to greet them. He smiled and greeted all the northern nobles, and enthusiastically led them to the stands on the left and right. The military parade begins. Seeing that the noble audience had taken their seats, Theon announced loudly with a smile. A messenger soldier standing at the foot of the high platform heard the order, immediately took out a black horn from his bosom, and blew it suddenly. Woo! With the sound of the horn, more than 2,000 fully armed warriors rushed out of the neat rows of military tents in the west. They gathered at the gate of the northern military camp. In a very short time, more than 2,000 people stood in a square military formation. Woo! The messenger soldier under the high platform saw that the warriors' square formation had been completed and blew the horn again. Dung! All the spearmen in the front row stuck the ends of their spears on the ground, making a neat sound. Then, they held the spears with both hands, pointed the spears at a 75-degree angle to the sky, and took neat steps at the same time. Chap, chap, chap. More than 500 spearmen, with the same rhythmic sound of their armor, walked from the north gate of the military camp to the south gate with the same steps. The northern nobles in the stands were completely dumbfounded at this moment. They had never seen such a neat army before. When the last row of spearmen just walked past the stands, the messenger blew the horn again. 500 archers repeated the pace of the spearmen and began to march. The only difference was that they carried their bows and arrows on their right shoulders. Dung! After them, as the horn sounded, 200 shield-bearing soldiers took the lead and marched towards the stands with heavy kite shields. Swish! Following their formation, there were 1,000 sword-bearing infantrymen who drew their long swords. The formations of these two arms also marched in a unified and neat pace towards the stands. There were more than 2,000 Winterfell soldiers in total, and no one made a mistake. The formations of each arm were kept quite intact. When the last row of sword-bearing infantrymen walked past the high platform, the messenger did not give the northern nobles in the stands a chance to put away their surprised expressions, and blew a long horn. Da-da-da. A sound of horse hooves came from outside the military camp, gradually becoming stronger. Rows of fully armed cavalry entered from the north gate of the military camp. They were relatively fast when entering the military camp, but when passing the high platform, they suddenly reined in their horses and slowed down. But even with this operation, from the perspective of the northern nobles in the stands, the rows of cavalry formations were still quite intact. More than 1,300 cavalrymen rode their horses across the high platform one after another. When they arrived at the south gate of the military camp, they lined up neatly next to the more than 2,000 archers who had already lined up. Looking at the Winterfell soldiers who had completely lined up and stood still, except for the occasional snort of the cavalry horses, there was no sound. The northern nobles slowly put away their shocked expressions and looked at the familiar faces on their left and right. They didn't know how to describe this perfectly neat military parade. But the military parade was not over yet. Now, the criminals will be escorted by Robb Stark, the acting Lord of the North. Rose Bolton of the Bolton family of the North. As Theon announced loudly on the high platform, more than 2,000 people suddenly shouted in unison, "Lord Robb, Lord Robb." As the huge shouts rang out, Rose, who was guarded by the fully armed Little John, Owen, and Daisy, and detained by the two brothers Eddard and Torhan, slowly walked into the camp at the south gate of the military camp. This period of time was tormenting for Rose. He no longer had the gentle appearance of the past. His face was haggard and his spirit was weak. When he walked in shackles, he was swaying. "Oh, my god. What is that?" With a cry of surprise, everyone saw that behind Rose and others, a direwolf that looked like a monster was slowly stepping. An ordinary direwolf would not exceed the size of a pony at most, but it was already taller than an adult warhorse in the north. At this moment, its soft grey fur was spread out and fluttering in the wind, and its two fangs, which were as big as daggers, were exposed outside its wolf mouth. Its slender limbs and muscular tissue were visibly developed, and I believe its explosive power was definitely not bad. The sharp nails on its claws left deep claw marks on the snow in the military camp. Most importantly, on its broad wolf back sat a handsome and majestic young man wearing the Lord's casual clothes and a black cloak on his shoulders. Robb Stark. Chapter 47 Warriors Cemetery. As Rose, who was in shackles, and Robb, who was riding a giant direwolf, slowly moved forward, the soldiers of Winterfell at the south gate of the military camp turned around and followed them to the platform. When Robb and others walked to the front of the platform, the nobles of the north felt the pressure of Bloodwind more deeply. A tall and strong northern warhorse and a direwolf as tall as a northern warhorse are two completely different concepts. Bloodwind under the platform had cold eyes, which seemed to be filled with the desire to kill. The wild predator's breath was full of his body, like an invisible net that tightly bound the nobles of the north. The nobles of the north didn't even want to speak at this moment. They even slowed down their breathing, fearing that a heavy breath would attract the attack of this ferocious predator. Robb, who was on the broad back of Bloodwind, saw that he had achieved the effect he wanted, and then sent his thoughts to Bloodwind. As Bloodwind gradually restrained his wildness, the wolf hair on his body was no longer in a state of opening, but softly closed to the skin, and the eyes full of killing desire also returned to their usual wisdom and agility. As if collectively thawing, the first thing the northern nobles in the stands did was to breathe deeply. Earl Wyman, feeling his heart beating wildly, finally had time to turn around and look at his old friend, only to see Earl Rickard also taking a deep breath. The Bloodwind he usually saw was always in a docile state with Robb by his side, not the dangerous predator just now, so this can be said to be the first time he really got to know the other side of Bloodwind. Rose was escorted by Little John and the other 5 people, and went up the stairs next to the platform. Bloodwind, who was a little higher than the platform, walked directly to the side of the platform, and Robb raised his foot and climbed onto the platform. After completing his task, Bloodwind lazily lay on the snow under the platform, not afraid of the cold snow at all. Seeing Robb on the platform, Theon nodded slightly to Robb, and then stood quietly beside him. On the platform, Rose was forced to kneel in the center of the platform by Eddard and his brother, facing the Winterfell army lined up outside the platform, with his back to the northern nobles on the stands on both sides. Theon and his 4 companions stood quietly around the platform, while Robb stood at the front of the platform, facing Rose and the northern nobles. "Thank you for coming, all the nobles in the north, who are loyal to the Stark family. Since this barracks was only completed yesterday, I didn't have time to come back to have dinner with you. I apologize for this." Robb spoke loudly at first, with routine polite words, and then changed the subject, and went straight to the topic of today. "The first thing I invited you to come here today is to watch the military parade, and the second thing is to invite you to witness this, the warrior's tomb." The nobles in the north followed the direction of Robb's finger, and saw at a glance that the dagger-shaped bluestone building on the top could still be seen in the barracks. People in the north know that there is a tomb of our Stark family in Winterfell. All the kings of the north and the heads of the Stark family are buried in it. From today on, this warrior's tomb will commemorate all the warriors who died fighting for Winterfell, and the surface of the tomb will be engraved with all their names. When the nobles in the north heard this, a small number of them shook their heads secretly, while most of them whispered. Earl Wyman was one of the few who shook his head. He felt that the young wolf lord's act of building a crypt for the dead soldiers was a thankless task. Instead of spending so many gold dragons, it would be more appropriate to give more pensions to the families of the dead soldiers. The Stark family's crypt was to mourn the ancestors of the family and to commemorate the glory of the entire family. Apart from his wolf guards, the other soldiers were basically civilians living at the bottom of society. After they died in battle, even their own families might soon forget them. Looking at the whispering nobles of the north, Robb didn't care and continued to speak loudly. For all the soldiers whose names are engraved on the warrior's tomb, their families will not only receive death pensions, but also receive additional benefits. If his wife has no source of income, Winterfell will provide her with a normal job. If his parents are old and unable to work, Winterfell will pay a monthly relief. If his children are still young and have no one to take care of them, Winterfell will soon establish a warrior orphanage to raise them to adulthood. When Robb's shocking words fell, not to mention the nobles of the north who were thinking about how much gold dragons this would cost, the soldiers of Winterfell, who had been able to remain quiet and stand silently in military posture just now, suddenly started to talk like a pot of boiling water. Some soldiers standing in the back who couldn't hear clearly asked the soldiers in front eagerly, "Lord Robb, long live. Willing to die for the Stark family. Robb Stark. Robb Stark." Among the more than 2,000 soldiers, I don't know who shouted excitedly first. But this excited shout, like a flame, instantly ignited the whole prairie fire. In the military camp, all kinds of excited shouts rang out, and in the end, only a neat and unified shout remained. That is, Robb's name. Rose, who was forcibly taken and kneeling on the high platform, kept his head down and remained silent at first, like a dead body. But when Robb loudly announced the extra treatment of the warrior's tomb, he suddenly looked up and met Robb's eyes facing him. Looking at Robb's wise look, Rose sighed in his heart. His head drooped again, his eyes staring at the ground of the high platform. From now on, the warriors of Winterfell will have no worries and fight bravely, and the civilians in the north will rush to Winterfell to join the army. Unless the Stark family digs their own graves and destroys the promise of this warrior's tomb, they will stay in the north forever. Looking at Rose, who was bowing his head, the northern nobles had complicated expressions. After feeling the enthusiastic response from the soldiers of Winterfell, Robb turned his back to them and raised his right hand, clenched his 5 fingers together, and made a tactical gesture of stop. The soldiers in the front line saw Robb's gesture and quickly passed on the order. In a very short time, the shouts that were as loud as waves just now became quiet in an instant. For the third item today, I, the acting Lord of Winterfell, Robb Stark of the Stark family, will initiate the trial of the Earl of the Dreadfort, Rose Bolton of the Bolton family. When the Winterfell soldiers behind him quickly quieted down, Robb's clenched right hand pointed downward, and Rose, who was kneeling on the ground with his head bowed, announced loudly, "I will be the first judge. The Earl of Carha, Rickard Karstark, will be the second judge, and the Earl of Hearth, John Umber, will be the third judge." Hearing that he was going to be tried, Rose, with a haggard face, looked up at Robb and laughed loudly. "Ha ha ha, I know that you must have sentenced me to death long ago. After going through this trial process, the respected Robb Stark will sentence me to either be hanged or beheaded. Therefore, I do not accept this unfair trial. As the Earl of the Bolton family, I ask for the witness of the old gods and request a trial by combat with the acting Lord Robb Stark. Thanks to Zinwan Yezi for his reward, and Teutonic for his monthly vote. At the same time, thanks to all readers for voting and reading every day. PS. I really read the comments and votes of every reader. Some of them voted as soon as it was 12 o'clock. Thank you for your support. I will write well and tell this story well. Chapter 48, Trial by Combat. In the stands, Lord Rickard and Gretchen had just stood up when they heard their names, and then sat back down when they heard Rose request a trial by combat. When the northern nobles heard Rose's words, they immediately started to talk about it, and some nobles have begun to question the fairness of this trial. Trial by combat is a way for Westeros to adjudicate and resolve disputes. Trial by combat can be proposed before the trial, or at any time during the trial. As long as the party survives a recognized fair fight to the death, it is the winner of the trial. Of course, the initiation of a trial by combat can be vetoed, but in Westeros, which believes in the gods and advocates heroism, even noble lords and royal family members rarely stop the trial by combat. Robb looked at Robos, who was of medium build, not very strong, and pale and haggard. He nodded and said, I agree to your request for trial by combat. Lord Robos, please find a proxy warrior willing to fight for you, otherwise you will have to fight on your own. Lord Robb, please give me this opportunity to fight for you. Hearing Robb's words, Robos was still thinking, and Daisy, who was standing on the side, immediately asked Robb loudly, Lord Robb, I'm willing to chop off his head for you, please choose me. Little John, who was wearing full plate armor, reacted a bit slower. After Daisy spoke, he shouted loudly. Then Owen and Eddard also reacted and rushed to fight for Robb. Robb shook his head, held out his hand to quiet them down, and then slowly said, thank you for risking your lives to fight for me. However, my father has always taught me, the one who sentences the death penalty must do it himself. Hearing him bring up Lord Eddard's teachings, Daisy and others knew that it was useless to persuade them again, and silently retreated to their original positions. Seeing that Robb was going to do it himself, Ro smiled and raised the shackles on his hands. Eddard glanced at Robb, and when he nodded, he took out the key from his body and unlocked the shackles for him. Robb pulled out his long sword from Theon's waist beside him, and threw it in front of Robos. Then, he reached out, and tore off his black cloak, drew his sword from his waist, and said to Robos, it seems that no one in the audience will fight for you, so come on. Lord Robos, outside the Dreadfort, I sent a messenger to tell you, I will end your life with my own hands now, it's time. Rose picked up the sword on the ground, stood up, and moved his hands and feet that had been shackled for a long time. The two brothers Eddard and Torrhen silently made way for them, and stood in a circle with Daisy and others on the periphery. In fact, the trial by combat can require the armor to be changed before the duel. But Robb and Robos, the two enemies who were about to fight to the death, understood each other's intentions, and the two sides tacitly fought without armor. Begin the fight. Seeing that Robb and the other were ready, Theon shouted loudly. As soon as he finished speaking, Robos approached Robb with his sword, raised in his right hand. As soon as he entered the attack range, he held the sword with both hands, raised it high, and then slashed at Robb. Clang! Robb's feet did not move, and his right hand raised the sword above his head with a calm expression, easily blocking Robos' slash. Robos' veins burst in both hands holding the sword, and he used all his strength to push the long sword down. But Robb offset the power of his long sword with just one hand. At the same time, in a voice that only the two of them could hear, he whispered to Robos, you are going to die anyway, so it is better to die in a trial by combat than to die with a crime. This will also make the northern nobles doubt that I forced you to be convicted and drive a thorn in their hearts. Of course, it would be better if you could kill me in a trial by combat, right? Robos heard this, cracked his mouth, and pulled out an ugly smile, and replied in a low voice, yes, isn't it the same for you? Since the trial by combat cannot be refused, it is better to convict me directly and shut the mouths of the northern nobles. I'm not strong to begin with, and I have been in prison for so long that my body is already empty. I will definitely die against you, the brave young wolf lord. Ha ha. Rose, who was exerting all his strength, spoke at the same time, which made him a little out of breath. After a slight pause, he continued, during this period, I have carefully recalled this war, although I wanted to cause chaos in the north at the beginning. At the same time, I want you, who is the first to take charge of Winterfell, to lose your prestige and hit the reputation of the Stark family. But at that time, I had never thought of launching a war against the Stark family. But the series of traps you designed were obviously intended to take the initiative to launch a war and weaken the power of the Bolton family. And when we first met in the Dreadfort, I could see from your eyes that you hated me very deeply and wanted to kill me from the bottom of your heart. Before I die, I want to know why. Lord Rose, you are indeed a smart man. You see me very clearly. As for why I want to kill you, it's because, in my previous life, I died in your hands. Robb chuckled, but because he was worried about the prying of the three-eyed crow in the dark, he did not tell Rose the reason in his heart. Don't you want to reveal it to someone who is about to die? Robb Stark, you are such a terrible person. Looking at Robb, who kept silent at the end, Robos couldn't help but sigh. Well, farewell, Lord Robos. While the two were talking, the power from Robos' sword was getting weaker and weaker. Seeing that he had finished what he wanted to say, Robb said goodbye to Robos. Before Robos could react, Robb used his right hand to push the long sword upward, swinging away the long sword that Robos had pressed on his head. At the same time, he quickly retracted his right hand and swung it out. Clang! Robos clenched his hands with all his strength, but he couldn't stop the long sword in his hand, which flew out of his hand after being knocked out by the opponent. Although Robos knew that his martial arts were not very strong, he never expected that he would have no power to fight back against Robb. Boom. 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 A stunned expression finally solidified on Robos' face, and Robb's second sword directly beheaded him. His head rolled to the ground on the high platform, making a few small noises, and his headless body, blood was gushing out from the carotid artery in his neck, splashing all over Robb's head and face. As a spectator of this trial by combat, Earl Wyman now has only one feeling, that is, this trial by combat was too sloppy. If Robos Bolton's head hadn't fallen on the platform, he would have even thought it was a stage drama. From his perspective, he only saw Robos swinging his sword, and then the two of them were in a stalemate. Robb easily knocked Robos' sword away with one hand, and then chopped off Robos' head with one sword. Lord Robb is too strong. Lord Rickard next to him was not like him, a layman in swordsmanship. He clearly knew the gap between Robb and him, so he couldn't help but utter an exclamation of admiration. Hearing the admiration of his old friend, thinking of the changes in Winterfell and the parade of the soldiers of Winterfell, Lord Wyman made a decision in his heart. That batch of mere ointment, just give it away, just charge the cost price. Chapter 49 Bad News. Seeing Theon calling the soldiers to clean up the bodies, Robb, who was sprayed with blood all over his head and face because he was too close to Robos, called out to him, bury the body and the head together. No need to stick a stick to show it to the public. Okay, Robb, go wash your face first. Seeing Robb's appearance, Theon handed over the cloak he had just picked up and said. Robb did not answer Theon. He took the cloak and wiped the blood on his face with the inside. Then he turned to the northern nobles on the stands with different expressions and said, Robos Bolton, the sinner who disturbed the order of the north, has received the punishment he deserves. His illegitimate son, Ramsay Snow, has made meritorious contributions by reporting his father. I will write a letter to His Majesty the King and request that Ramsay Bolton's name be legalized, so that he can inherit the title of Earl of the Dreadfort. May I ask if the northern families present have any objections to this matter? The northern nobles saw the bodies and bloodstains that the soldiers were cleaning up on the high platform. All of them were silent, and no one raised any objection. In fact, the noble representatives who came on behalf of their families had no right to raise any objection at all, and the lords who came in person, their descendants basically served as high officials in Winterfell, so it was even less likely that they would have any objection. Seeing the silence, Robb showed a somewhat creepy smile on his face, which was still covered with blood, and continued to say, everyone, all the content for today has ended. Please go back to Winterfell to produce evidence and claim the goods of your respective caravans. By the way, these goods were transported from the Dreadfort, and thousands of eyes were watching, so it is impossible to fake them. When the noble representatives heard this, they felt as if they had been pardoned. They hurriedly saluted Robb and then left, preparing to return to Winterfell. The lords from all over the country gathered around and talked with Robb to get closer to each other. Earl Wyman was one of them, but when he asked Robb about the terms such as currency circulation and stimulating domestic demand that he had not understood before, he confusedly gave the mere ointment that he had originally intended to sell to Winterfell at cost price as tuition to Winterfell for free. As the time for Robb and others to communicate passed, finally, before noon, all the noble lords set off to return to Winterfell. Robb, who had washed up, enjoyed the lunch prepared by the logistics troops with all the soldiers. Then he began to reward the whole army after the war. The 5 generals of various arms who participated in the war, including Theon, could not be promoted for the time being. As for the canonization of the Knights' territory, this war had not reached this level, so Robb rewarded each person with gold dragons according to his military exploits. Owen, who led the spearmen, to fight to the death, to entangle the enemy's heavy cavalry, received a reward of 20 gold dragons. Theon, who was responsible for the overall command of the archers, and commanded the ordinary infantry to meet the enemy, received a reward of 15 gold dragons. Little John, who led the lancers to fight bravely, was rewarded with 10 gold dragons, and Eddard, who led the light cavalry to fight in coordination, was rewarded with 10 gold dragons. Torhan, who led the logistics troops to complete the supply and cover mission, was rewarded with 5 gold dragons. Trog, the commander of the militia infantry, was transferred to Winterfell as the commander of the infantry, and was rewarded with 3 gold dragons. Robb allocated 300 gold dragons from the spoils in advance as a reward for Earl Rickard and the Karstark cavalry, and he also claimed back the goods lost by his own caravan. The more than 3,000 Winterfell soldiers in the barracks, except for the archers who had already received rewards in Stone Iron Town, the remaining cavalry were awarded with 100 silver deer each. Of course, the beheading merits of each soldier were accumulated and recorded by the military judge, and they could be promoted to one level of military rank when they reached the specified standard. As for the more than 530 Winterfell soldiers who died in the battle, each of them received a pension of 200 silver deer, and their names were included in the warrior's crypt. The 2,800 militiamen who died in the battle received a pension of 100 silver deer each. The pension that Robb issued this time was not only not low, but could even be said to be very generous. You know, during the late war in Westeros, prices soared, but the life of the Hound was only rewarded with 100 silver deer. This time, including the rewards of the Karstark cavalry, Robb spent a total of 2,100 gold dragons, which was almost a fraction of the gold dragons obtained by the Dreadfort. The Dreadfort has indeed been extraordinary for many years. There are more than 12,300 gold dragons alone, and the rest of the various materials combined can also be worth thousands of gold dragons. But Robb believes that the most practical spoils of this war should be those war horses and numerous weapons and armor. After all, gold dragons need to be converted before they can be used in war, while war horses and weapons and armor can be used directly in war. In the original drama, Highgarden had countless wealth and had money and food. But in the end, the entire family was destroyed, and countless gold dragons were taken by Cersei to repay the debt of the Iron Vault. After obtaining this batch of war supplies, Robb only needs to step up the training of qualified warriors, then the elite troops of Winterfell can at least double. Although Robb obtained a large amount of spoils from the Bolton family through this war, compared with the assets and liabilities of hundreds of thousands and millions of gold dragons in the southern territories, the north is still too barren. The environment in the north is not suitable for slow farming, and the time left for Robb to develop is very short. As the time to the War of the Five Kings is getting shorter and shorter, he is actually very anxious in his heart and has been looking for ways to quickly strengthen the combat effectiveness of the army. But the little things from ancient China that he thought of can have some miraculous effects if used occasionally, but they cannot be relied on. When Robb finished dealing with the affairs of the military camp and returned to Winterfell, the sun was gradually setting. When they were still some distance away from Winterfell, they saw Catelyn riding a horse with 2 guards. Looking at their riding speed, Robb's heart sank, and he immediately rode up to meet them. "Robb, your father had a big fight with the king, and then resigned as the king's hand. My sister Lyssa sent hundreds of Vale Knights in my name to the Crossroads Inn to forcibly take the little devil and Sir Roderick back to the Eyrie." Robb and the other met up and just stopped their horses. Catelyn spoke anxiously. "These are all news from a few days ago. I don't know what the situation is now. I'm worried about Ned." "Mother, it's useless for you to be so anxious now. Don't worry about Tyrion and Sir Roderick for the time being. I'll take care of my father's affairs. Let's go back to Winterfell first." After Robb comforted Catelyn, he asked everyone to return to Winterfell first. Lyssa actually took action personally and sent soldiers to kidnap Tyrion and Sir Roderick, which is completely different from the original plot. However, the Sellsword Bronn should have gone to the Eyrie as in the original, and Tyrion should still be safe as in the original. As for his father, The time before King Robert was killed by the wild boar was getting shorter and shorter. We must act now. Riding on his warhorse, Robb's mind was full of thoughts. After determining the target, he turned his head with a firm look and looked south. Thanks to Jinzao for his 1,500 points reward, The Will of the Fire King, and the book friend 2017120120264931 for their points reward. Thanks to Jinzao, Heio Daosu, the early bird, and Mo Yashinju for their monthly votes. At the same time, thanks to all the readers for voting and reading every day. Chapter 50 heading south. Late at night the next day, Robb, who had arranged the affairs of Winterfell, quietly left from the south gate of Winterfell with the Winterfell cavalry disguised as an ordinary caravan. This disguised caravan was a small caravan with only 3 carriages. Robb brought the 2 brothers Eddard and Torhan, as well as 16 carefully selected cavalry. Each of them wore old civilian clothes, with beards and scars on their faces, and looked decent on the surface. Since Winterfell announced the treatment of the Warriors' Cemetery, the nearby civilians have set off a wave of signing up for the army. At present, Theon and Owen are in charge of this matter. It is expected that, after screening by age and physique, 2,000 to 3,000 new recruits can be recruited. Daisy is responsible for the guarding of the relatives in the main castle. Little John is responsible for the daily training of the barracks and the upcoming training of new recruits. Because of his conspicuous body shape, and because he and Trog are responsible for presiding over the daily training of the military camp. The wolf guards used by robbers' bearings are all middle-level officers in the army, and there is no way to withdraw them. Besides, this time, the purpose was not to attack King's Landing, but to rescue Eddard, Sansa and Arya through some plans. Robb brought these people, not only to cover up the disguise, but also to prevent the need for help. In fact, Robb's comprehensive strength now can be said to be at the top level of Westeros. Before, the red mist was inflowed in small quantities, and the negative impact was relatively small, and the positive impact was also very small. But after the loss of control in the Battle of the Dreadfort, Robb's understanding of the red mist became more in-depth. The most serious negative impact is that it will make him lose his mind, lose control, and be full of desire for slaughter. The positive impact can continuously provide physical strength, accelerate the healing of wounds, and finally enhance physical fitness imperceptibly. In fact, Robb has long felt that his physical fitness is getting better and stronger. He always thought that this was the result of hard training every day, but after the loss of control last time, Robb clearly felt that his physical fitness has been greatly improved. Not to mention anything else, in terms of strength alone, Little John is no longer as good as him. This was tested in the military camp a few days ago. At that time, Little John's expression was extremely rich. After all, what he was most proud of was his own strength. As for Bloodwind's current attributes, it can be said that they are quite balanced. Name, Bloodwind. Contractor, Robb Stark. Constitution 30, Speed 30, Strength 30, Clan, Psychic direwolf. 6, Wolf Pack, Soldier Wolf, Nymeria, Servant Wolf, Lady, Blood Contract points 32. All of its attributes have been added to 30 points, and it cannot continue to increase. Robb does not know whether this is its growth limit or there are other conditions that have not been met. This gold finger can only be explored by oneself. Even if there is a very rough instruction, Robb would not be so annoyed. The accumulated blood contract points are also a hidden danger. As long as he continues to fight and kill, the blood contract points will accumulate, and he will inevitably get out of control. At that time, he will not be able to continue to consume the attributes. Will he lose control for a certain period of time? Or will he lose control permanently and become a madman who only knows how to kill? Robb had no idea of the consequences of losing control again, so his appetite has been greatly reduced during this period, fearing that his blood points will continue to increase. By the way, killing Robos Bolton yesterday actually brought him 8 blood points. In addition to the defected soldier leader Dick who was killed before, this can be said to be the second time he has gained more than the usual 2 blood points. Fortunately, when the Battle of the Dreadfort went out of control, his blood points exceeded 70, so there is still some room left. Speaking of Bloodwind, I'm afraid that it will suffer some grievances during this period of travel. Because of its conspicuous size, it is now locked in the last specially customized carriage. In fact, Robb can ride south quickly to King's Landing without Bloodwind. But throwing away his trump card far away, and taking risks alone, that should be the protagonist in the movie of the previous life. Although the transport carriage slowed down a bit, Robb and his team basically rushed on the road except for the necessary rest time. It took only half a month to reach the border between the King's Territory and the Riverlands. Sal's Corner. Sal's Corner is a tower fortress with a strange name and 8-foot thick walls. It is the fief of the Hog family, a vassal knight of the Harvard family. Of course, you can't enter the tower fortress, but there are also settlements spontaneously established by nearby civilians on the periphery, like a winter market. Although the place is not big, it has everything from food, clothing, housing and transportation. Overall, it is still a bit busy and prosperous. After all, the location here is superior. It is less than a day's ride away from King's Landing. It is the first resting point at the starting point of the King's Road. After this long journey, except for Robb, everyone else in Winterfell is exhausted and in poor spirits. So he decided to rest here for a night and set off to King's Landing tomorrow. Robb and others lived in a shabby and ordinary hotel here. The consumption in the south is indeed much higher than that in the north. The food and accommodation of their group, including the concentrated feed for the horses, cost a total of 110 silver deer. This was the discount that Ed had bargained for. At the beginning, the innkeeper heard their northern accents and wanted a gold royal. When Robb and his friends arrived at the inn, it was almost sunset. He arranged for the carriage to park and personally got on the carriage to appease Bloodwind, who had been conveying his impatience to him. Then he took everyone to the inn hall to enjoy dinner. This inn looked shabby and ordinary, but their business was really good. When Robb and his friends entered the huge inn hall, 2/3 of the tables were already occupied by guests eating, drinking, and chatting. Robb and his friends sat down and waited for a while, and the innkeeper served them a customized dinner for their stay. A piece of ordinary but-filling bread, a large bowl of barley and venison soup, some green spinach, and a large glass of inferior ale. Compared with the delicacies he made in Winterfell, these foods made Robb frown. It's not that they can't afford good accommodation and good food, but since you are pretending to be a small caravan, then at least in terms of food, clothing, housing and transportation, you should be in line with the disguise. So when Ed had bargained with the innkeeper, he didn't say anything to stop him. In his previous life on Blue Star, Robb was the kind of man who could buy clothes and shoes, enter the store, pay the bill, and go out in less than 10 minutes. Bang. Just as Robb and his party had eaten most of the mediocre food, the door of the inn was suddenly knocked open. The man who stumbled into the inn hall shouted excitedly, "The latest news. Our king recruited a few prostitutes into the Red Castle today, but they died in the stomachs of these prostitutes." Bang. Robb's face suddenly changed when he heard the news shouted by the man, and he punched the dining table heavily, splashing the wine and remaining food everywhere. Impossible. End of this chapter. Thank you very much for reaching the end. Don't forget to like. Looking for more exclusive content and immediate access? Subscribe to our Patreon. Remember, every like, subscription, or donation encourages us to continue. Thanks to everyone. See you in the next video.